Chapter 621. The guards at the entrance of the underground city were still led by Lu Ting. Lu Ting himself was also standing in front of the crowd. Looking at the approaching Guyu Lord, his heart was in turmoil. He felt extremely depressed, and even a sense of grievance as though he had nothing left to live for. What kind of luck was this? What kind of world was this? Wasn't he just a guard here? There were countless people like him in the whole of Immortal City and Xianxia, but why did it seem like he was the unluckiest? The person walking over was not an ordinary person, but an unreachable demigod perfected lord. Even though this perfected lord and his starry hall were relatively low-key, he was still in existence that cultivators like Lu Ting could only look up to. To put it bluntly, if he angered this Guyu perfected lord, she could just find an excuse to kill him with one slap. It would be difficult for Fuyunji to avenge Lu Ting. What could they do to a demigod perfected lord? To deal with a demigod perfected lord, the whole of Fuyunji would have to go all out, or they could directly get rid of someone like perfected Lord Tianlan. Only then would they be able to seek justice for a small fry like Lu Ting. But was it worth it to do so? Even though everyone in the world said that all living things were equal, but in this Middle Earth, there were still differences in the lives of people. Of course, those who could reach the level of a soul formation perfected lord were all peerless talents. Not only did they have extremely high cultivation levels, but they also had their own poise when interacting with others. Normally, they wouldn't hold a grudge against insignificant figures. But what if Lu Ting didn't want to become that, if at all? He hoped that there wouldn't be any accidents at all. He loved being alive, and there were still many things he wanted to enjoy. He just had a chance to get acquainted with young Master Lu Chen, who had a bright future ahead of him. He didn't want to die at all. Lu Ting sighed in his heart. If only I could just ignore everything and run away. Lu Ting sighed. But Fuyunji had always had strict rules. Since they were stationed here, they naturally had the responsibility of guarding. Lu Ting was the leader of the guards, so he was even more duty-bound. If he slipped away, the person who wanted to kill him would be Fuyunji. In comparison, Lu Ting didn't want to go against the Fuyunji that he was in at all. He wouldn't even dare to. Thus, he braced himself and tried to put on a warm and respectful smile. He bowed to the Guyu perfected lord and said, "Greetings, my lord. I am Lu Ting, a guard from Fuyunji." True Monarch Guyu stopped and looked at Lu Ting, who was blocking her way. Lu Ting immediately felt a chill run down his spine. In that instant, he even had the illusion that the wind had suddenly become shrill, as if a huge palm was about to slap him into meat paste in the next moment. Fortunately, after calming himself down, the surroundings seemed to be as calm as before. Lu Ting sneaked a glance at his surroundings and discovered that Guyu Supreme's expression was calm and composed, without any signs of anger. However, the floating clouds division guards behind him had all silently retreated a few steps back, causing Lu Ting to stand out in front of Guyu Supreme all of a sudden, making him stand out in front of Guyu Supreme. These bastards! Lu Ting was furious. He secretly swore that if he could survive today, he would go back and teach these unreliable subordinates a lesson. He would torture them until they were half dead to vent his anger. But now was not the time to vent his anger. There was still a terrifying demigod perfected lord standing in front of him. Lu Ting revealed a smile that was uglier than crying. He laughed dryly and said, "My lord, this place is guarded by Fuyunji. Our sect's hall leader Shui personally told us that unless it is true Monarch Tianlan or herself, no one is allowed to enter the underground cave." True Monarch Guyu frowned and looked at Lu Ting. As if a bucket of cold water had been poured over his head, Lu Ting felt as if his body had fallen into an ice cellar. Even his voice was slightly trembling. At this time, Lu Ting did not know if it was the strict rules of Fuyunji that were suppressing him or if he was too afraid and forgot to escape. Could it be that he was really so unlucky that he would die here today? Just as Lu Ting was letting his imagination run wild, he suddenly heard Guyu perfected monarch say with an indifferent expression, "I've gone down several times with your perfected monarch Tianlan, including a while ago when our two halls were stationed here together. Why, now you won't even let me go?" Lu Ting was first shocked, then happy. He was shocked that this true monarch seemed to be determined to go down to the underground cave. Then he was overjoyed that true monarch Guyu seemed to be in a good mood and was actually willing to be reasonable. It was good that she was willing to be reasonable. Lu Ting's spirit was lifted and his expression became even more respectful. He bowed towards true monarch Guyu and tried his best to show his obedience and respect. Then he said softly, "Reporting to my lord, this is indeed not because I have the guts to make things difficult for you, but because it is the rules set by the higher-ups. You see, with your status, it shouldn't be difficult for you to know the rules of our Fuyunji. Although I absolutely do not dare to stop you, but if you just walk in like this, then I will probably be thrown into Fuyunji's prison and have my tendons pulled out and my skin skinned." True monarch Guyu frowned and did not speak, but was obviously hesitant. It seemed that this true monarch was indeed a kind person. Even though their statuses were like heaven and earth, he was still unwilling to make things difficult for a small fry. Lu Ting was extremely grateful for this and had a very good impression of true monarch Guyu. He almost knelt down and kowtowed. After a while, true monarch Guyu nodded and said, "I understand your concerns and the fact that you have no choice but to do this, but I do have an important matter to attend to. How about this? Send someone to the Kunlun temple to pass a message and tell Tianlan that I am here. As for whether to let me in or not, just ask him to give me a clear answer. But don't blame me for not reminding you, I won't wait forever. I will give you at most an hour." After saying that, he walked to the side and stood with his hands behind his back, as if he really was waiting. Seeing this scene, Lu Ting was so touched that tears almost flowed down his cheeks. He hurriedly thanked him, then turned around and rushed back to the crowd. He did not even have the time to get angry at his subordinates who did not have the spirit of loyalty. First, he snatched the best chair and carefully placed it beside true monarch Guyu. Then, he came back to inform the crowd, turned around and ran towards the Kunlun temple on Mount Tianlong. True monarch Tianlan only found out about what happened at the foot of the mountain after a little longer than the time it took to drink a cup of tea. His face was very calm, but his eyes flickered a few times, as if he was thinking about something. This was the first time Lu Ting, who was kneeling in the middle of the hall, stepped into this place that was the highest place for people in the Fuyunji system. He did not dare to look around. After a while, he suddenly heard an angry rebuke from above. "How dare you, Guyu? Are you trying to provoke me?" A gust of wind blew and the tall and burly figure had already reached the entrance of the hall. Lu Ting stood up in shock and heard true monarch Tianlan's cold voice. "Follow me to meet this arrogant old man." Chapter 622. The hand that grabbed Lu Chen was slender and white. Perhaps because it was too pale, there was no color of blood. One could even vaguely see the blue blood vessels inside. This palm looked very perfect. If one didn't care about the cold aura, it could be considered very beautiful. But it was very cold. That hand was very, very cold. It seemed to be a bit colder than ice. A chill passed through his skin. Lu Chen frowned. Behind him, Atsu at the door of this room growled in a low voice. It was a bit vigilant and angry. In contrast, Lu Chen didn't seem to be angry. He seemed to be more surprised. He stared at the hand that grabbed him for a moment, then lowered his head, looked at White Lotus and said, "You're awake?" White Lotus's body was on her side. It seemed that she had been lying down for a long time. A strand of beautiful hair slipped from her temple to her cheek. It was black, shiny, smooth, and had a trace of silent laziness. If it was a sunny day on an embroidered bed in a young girl's boudoir on a sunny afternoon, this might be a beautiful picture with a poetic feeling. But at this moment, in the cold surroundings, she seemed a bit haggard and lonely. White Lotus slowly opened her eyes. Her face was still a bit pale. The injuries caused by her injuries had not yet healed. The long sleep seemed to have made her a little confused. She felt unfamiliar with her surroundings. She slowly looked around and then sat up. Her eyes swept around and then fell on Lu Chen, who was sitting beside her. She lowered her head and saw that her hand was still holding Lu Chen's hand. She held it very tightly. Her nails could even be faintly seen slightly sinking into the flesh of Lu Chen's palm. Atsu slowly took 2 steps forward. Its pair of eyes stared at White Lotus. It no longer made a sound, but a pair of fangs was revealed. Even some of the hair on its neck was faintly standing up. It looked like it was going to pounce on White Lotus in the next moment. But at this moment, Lu Chen's other hand on his side gently waved at Atsu. Atsu saw this movement and then stopped. Lu Chen looked at White Lotus. His face was calm, but his eyes were not all gentle and peaceful. He seemed to be a bit complicated. He asked White Lotus, "What's wrong?" White Lotus was startled. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she waved her arm, seemingly wanting to take her hand back. But at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly turned his hand over and instantly grabbed White Lotus's hand. He then continued to ask, "Do you feel uncomfortable?" Her hand was very cold, but his rough hand was very warm. White Lotus's arm paused for a moment as if she was thinking for a moment. Then she said in a low voice, "I'm fine." Of course, White Lotus couldn't really be fine. She was just being polite. As long as perfected Lord Tianlong didn't take action, Lu Chen basically couldn't think of anyone on Tianlong Mountain who could cure her strange injury. Of course, it might be possible for the other 5 perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, but the difficulty of making them take action would not be lower than that of perfected Lord Tianlong. Even though Lu Chen took the risk to use the power of black fire to restrain the violent spiritual power in White Lotus's body, the effect was far beyond his expectations. Perhaps this was also the power of black fire. But since White Lotus was awake, he had something to ask her. "How did you get the injury on your body?" He looked at White Lotus and did not beat around the bush. Instead, he went straight to the point. In particular, there's an incomparably violent and powerful spiritual energy in your body. I've never seen it before. Where did it come from? White Lotus's body trembled, and her face became paler. She moved her arm hard again, as if she wanted to pull her hand back like a child to protect herself. But Lu Chen's palm didn't move at all, and he still held her firmly. "I've asked Tianlong to see your injury. There's no need for you to pretend." He looked at White Lotus, whose face changed dramatically in an instant, with a hint of sarcasm on his face. He said, "Why, did you think you could hide it from him?" White Lotus wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Finally, she let out a long sigh. Lu Chen frowned. In terms of age, White Lotus was only a young girl. Her sigh sounded as if she had already experienced the vicissitudes of life. She sounded like an old woman without any vitality to speak of. "What happened to your injury?" he asked again. White Lotus looked at Lu Chen's serious face, hesitated for a moment, and said, "I wanted to follow you and Oxen that day, so I followed you into the underground cave." Lu Chen nodded and thought it was true. Then he heard White Lotus said, "Later, in the underground, you and Oxen suddenly retreated for no reason. I didn't leave immediately, but walked around the underground and looked around. As a result, I was suddenly controlled by a weirdo." Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, "A weirdo?" White Lotus nodded and said after thinking for a moment, "It was a man wearing a mask. If I'm not wrong, he seemed to be very similar to the legendary ghost elder of the devil cult." Lu Chen fell silent and didn't know what to say for a moment. After a while, he gently let go of White Lotus's hand and asked, "What happened later?" White Lotus withdrew her palm and gently rubbed it with her hand. She said, "After he controlled me, he put a restriction on me. Then I fainted and didn't know anything. When I woke up, I was here." Lu Chen frowned slightly and looked at White Lotus's eyes. He frowned and said, "You don't remember what happened later?" "I don't remember." White Lotus answered straightforwardly and firmly. "What happened later? Did you bring me back?" Lu Chen sighed and said with a wry smile, "More or less." Later, Tianlong and I went underground together, and then we found something wrong with a house in the underground city. When we went over to have a look, we found you. White Lotus wanted to ask a few more questions, but at this moment, a voice suddenly came from outside the house. It was a voice both of them were familiar with. Old Ma arrived and said loudly, "Lu Chen, come quickly. Immortal Milord asked you to go to the entrance of the underground cave at the foot of the mountain immediately. He said that Immortal Guyu has gone there and there seems to be some trouble." "Immortal Guyu of Star Hall?" Lu Chen immediately stood up. Although that immortal usually kept a low profile, as long as it involved a perfected master of Huashan realm, it would not be a small matter. Moreover, they were in the underground cave where there were endless troubles. You take a rest first. Don't wander around and wait for me to come back. Lu Chen turned around and said to White Lotus, then strode out. Atsu stared at White Lotus and followed him out of the door. As expected, he saw Old Ma waiting outside the door. Lu Chen greeted him and walked down the mountain quickly. At the same time, he asked casually, "Why don't you go in and talk?" Old Ma shrugged and shook his body, which seemed to have gained weight recently. He said, "I don't like the atmosphere in the room. It's a little cold." Lu Chen's footsteps paused slightly, but the expression on his face didn't change much. He still walked quickly. Chapter 623. Xianxia was a huge organization that commanded the world. Its prestige was so high that there was not even a second famous sect that could be compared to it. They looked down on the world and were invincible. At the same time, they announced to most of the cultivators and mortals that Xianxia was a united alliance, a victorious alliance, and an alliance that upheld justice. Anyone who dared to go against Xianxia had only one ending: death. The devil cult was the best example. So what if they had a long history? So what if they were powerful? So what if they were vicious and vicious? In the end, they were all defeated by the efforts of Xianxia and the world's righteous, and they were about to become yesterday's flower. At least in today's world, as long as Xianxia did not have any problems, this organization would be invincible in the world. Most people in the world understood this. Of course, the people in Xianxia also understood this. Therefore, most of the time, everyone maintained a harmonious, gentle, and united appearance. As for the disputes, quarrels, and struggles for power and profit, of course, they were all false rumors, malicious rumors created by demons and clowns like the devil cult. As the top figures in Xianxia, the few divine transformation stage perfected cultivators certainly had a deep friendship with each other. They got along well with each other, and there was no estrangement at all. For example, on this day, on the long street in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City, perfected cultivator Tianlan and perfected cultivator Guyu were standing outside the entrance of the tunnel, full of smiles, talking cheerfully and wittily, talking about everything in the world. They were outstanding and extraordinary, like immortals, showing the bearing of two divine transformation stage perfected cultivators and the indestructible strength of Xianxia unity. Well, except that their voices were a little louder when they were talking. When Lu Chen arrived at the street with Atsu and Old Ma, he found that both sides of the street had been surrounded by Fiyunji's people. All outsiders were blocked. Except for Xianxia, or to be exact, Fiyunji's people, no one was allowed to pass. Needless to say, the purpose of this method was to cover up and keep the secret. However, Lu Chen did not have the slightest confidence in the effect of this method. At least in Xianxia, the other major forces would definitely know what was happening here. Everyone was a sieve, and they all knew what they were doing. With Lu Chen's identity, the Fiyunji guards certainly wouldn't stop him, so the two of them smoothly entered the long street. After walking on the streets that were quieter than usual for a while, Lu Chen heard a familiar deep voice that was like rolling thunder, extremely imposing and dignified. Except for Supreme Tianlan, there was no one else. The voice rumbled in front of them like thunder, Bulsh *T. The bald Supreme Tianlan was very annoyed and cursed. Lu Chen and Old Ma's footsteps paused subconsciously, and then they looked at each other. Old Ma looked a little embarrassed. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought, and his expression was a little funny. However, Lu Chen was much more natural in front of him. He said calmly, "That's how boorish people are." Old Ma's face turned pale, and then he looked at Lu Chen bitterly and complained, "I know you're bold and dare to say anything, but can you not say it to me?" Lu Chen waved his hand carelessly and said, "It's okay, I believe you, and I'm not afraid of that damn baldy." "But I'm afraid, brother." Old Ma's fat face fell, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He said, "I'm afraid that if those words reach the ears of that lord, you'll be fine, but I'll be punished as a punching bag. What should I do then?" Lu Chen was stunned and said, Is that possible? Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "What do you think?" Lu Chen thought for a while and then nodded. "You don't say." "I've thought about it carefully. That damn Baldy might really do such a thing. It's a tactic that he often uses to beat the mountain to scare the tiger." Old Ma glared at him, and it seemed that he had nothing to say to this person. Lu Chen laughed heartily and patted Old Ma's shoulder. For some reason, after chatting and laughing with his old friend for a while, his tense and gloomy mood had lightened up a lot. Even the street in front of him seemed a little more spacious. Lu Chen laughed and patted Old Ma's shoulder. "Old Ma," Lu Chen walked forward with him with some emotion, and at the same time said, "To be honest, it's all thanks to you accompanying me for so many years. You're almost the only old friend I have. It's really good to have someone to talk to." Old Ma snorted, raised his head a little, and then said in a low voice, "That's good. Please tell me in advance if there's a chance to save my life, so that I can run away early." Lu Chen laughed heartily before sending a kick over. Perfected Lord Tianlan and Perfected Lord Guyu, the two giants who stood at the peak of Zhengxianmeng, were currently having a verbal exchange at the entrance of the tunnel. Both sides were friendly and sincere, and their words were cautious and accurate. Even when they occasionally asked about each other's personal safety, they were very polite. Moreover, both of them were very restrained, adhering to the principle of a gentleman using his mouth and not his fists. Although there was an earth-shattering sound, the scene didn't collapse. At most, the ground couldn't withstand the heavy pressure and cracked, and some stones were shattered as a demonstration. When Lu Chen walked over, he found that Lu Ting and the other guards were standing far away, looking as if they wished they could turn into stone people and not see or hear anything. Even when they saw Lu Chen and the others coming, they didn't say anything. At the entrance of the tunnel, the two perfected lords were still standing there, looking at them with their eyes wide open. It seemed that they had a big fight. Lu Chen looked at them and sighed in his heart. If it was possible, he really didn't want to walk next to these two obviously angry perfected lords, but the situation didn't let him go, so he had to walk forward. However, after walking for a short distance, Lu Chen suddenly felt that something was wrong. He looked back and found that Old Ma didn't follow him. Not only that, this guy even took a few steps back. Lu Chen scolded in a low voice, "You bastard, where's the spirit of brotherhood that you talked about as an old friend?" Old Ma said seriously, "Go by yourself, I'll help you collect your corpse." As he said that, he waved his hand, looking as if he wanted Lu Chen to go and not be a burden to him. Lu Chen rolled his eyes. He couldn't do anything to this cunning old friend of his. However, when he looked back, he found that the black dog had been following him all along and had no intention of backing down. This time, Lu Chen was very relieved. He sighed and said, "Humans are worse than dogs. Atsu is still more reliable." Atsu barked. Lu Chen smiled, but then he patted Atsu's head and pressed it to the ground. He said in a low voice, "Stay here." Atsu was silent and then lay down. Lu Chen walked over and came to Perfected Lord Tianlan's side. The two big bosses' gazes fell on him, like two mountains pressing down on him. Facing two angry Perfected Lords of the Divine Transformation realm, the pressure was really not ordinary. Lu Chen took a deep breath, then with a respectful expression he greeted the two of them. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little angry. He sneered and said, "You came at the right time. Our master of Starry Hall has a lot of opinions about Fuyunji. He even said that there's something wrong in the catacombs below and insisted on going down to take a look. Forget it, I can't be bothered to go alone with you. Lu Chen, accompany Perfected Lord Guyu down for a walk. If there's anything strange, don't hide it from us and tell us when you come back." Lu Chen raised his brows and glanced at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Seeing that the latter's expression was the same as usual, Lu Chen nodded after a moment of silence. "Sir." After that, he made an inviting gesture to Perfected Lord Guyu and said, "This way please." Chapter 624. True Lord Guyu saw Lu Chen's actions and heard his calm and polite invitation, but he didn't move immediately. After sizing up Lu Chen, he didn't even respond to Lu Chen. Instead, he frowned slightly and raised his head to look at True Lord Tianlan. It was as if he didn't see Lu Chen as a person, Or perhaps he felt that Lu Chen wasn't qualified to speak to him. Lu Chen stood there silently. His expression didn't change, and he wasn't angry at True Lord Gu Yu's disrespect. True Lord Gu Yu looked at True Lord Tianlan. Although he didn't say anything, his expression was very angry. He probably felt that they were both soul formation true lords, so he couldn't dismiss him so easily. However, behind that angry expression, a trace of surprise and doubt flashed across the depths of his eyes. At this distance, only True Lord Tianlan could see the extremely secretive hint of inquiry in his eyes. True Lord Tianlan ignored it and waved his hand impatiently. Old geezers are always meddlesome. I don't have the patience to accompany you down. There are many things on this mountain. Lu Chen is my disciple. Letting him take you down is already giving you a lot of face. With that, he waved his sleeve and snorted coldly, looking very disdainful of True Lord Gu Yu. The atmosphere between the two of them immediately became tense, causing the surrounding guards to turn pale with fright. True Lord Gu Yu kept staring at True Lord Tianlan's eyes, as if he could see something from this damned Baldy's eyes. After a while, he nodded as if he knew the answer he wanted. He sneered and said to Lu Chen indifferently, "Lead the way." Lu Chen was the first to jump into the tunnel. He was no stranger to this place as he had come here many times. Just as he was about to turn around and wait for Gu Yu True Monarch, he felt a blur in front of him and the True Monarch's figure had already appeared behind him. Even with Lu Chen's current cultivation, he couldn't see True Lord Gu Yu's movements clearly. Lu Chen's heart trembled slightly, but his expression didn't change. He nodded to True Lord Gu Yu and was about to ask him to come with him. However, True Lord Gu Yu had already strode forward and said, "Let's go. I've been here many times and know what I'm doing." Lu Chen knew that he was speaking the truth. Back then, True Lord Tianlan True Lord Gu Yu had invited people from Star Hall to work in this underground cave. He had seen True Lord Gu Yu many times in this underground city. But now, if he didn't guess wrongly, this place should have been marked as a forbidden zone. Even the people from Fuyunji couldn't enter easily. In other words, in the houses near the strange statue, the bloody scene could still be there. True Lord Gu Yu came down to find trouble. Lu Chen probably knew a little about it. Of course, he didn't dare to let True Lord Gu Yu casually discover the crime scene. However, True Lord Gu Yu didn't seem to give Lu Chen any room to dissuade him. After saying that, he continued walking without any hesitation. Lu Chen was a little anxious. He secretly scolded Baldy a few more times. Just now, he couldn't communicate with Baldy in a hurry. Suddenly, he ordered him to come down. Lu Chen had no idea what he wanted to do. As they walked, the strange blood moon's light shone down and shone on the two of them. Lu Chen looked up and felt that his body was a little heavy. It seemed that the blood moon seemed to have changed. It seemed to have expanded a lot and the light was also much stronger. But he didn't know if it was directly related to the blood sea in the sky outside. True Lord Gu Yu also looked up at the blood moon in the sky. His face didn't change, but a trace of worry flashed in the depths of his eyes. Then he walked towards the center of the underground city. Lu Chen followed behind him and was secretly anxious. The house where the accident happened was near the statue. If they walked over like this, with True Lord Gu Yu's skills, he would almost definitely find out that something was wrong. Just as he was racking his brains to think of a way to solve this problem and lead Gu Yu Perfected Monarch astray, he suddenly heard Gu Yu Perfected Monarch, who was walking in front of him, say, "Your master trusts you very much." When Lu Chen heard this, he was stunned for a moment. He didn't really understand what this true lord meant. But then he still nodded and said, "Thank you, Master Gu Yu, for your praise. My master's kindness to me is as heavy as a mountain. I have always, he has never trusted a young person like this." True Lord Gu Yu interrupted Lu Chen's words. He stopped and turned to look at Lu Chen. "This is a rare fate. It is also a great opportunity. You must cherish it." Lu Chen was stunned again. At this moment, he could obviously feel that there seemed to be some unfinished meaning in this true lord's words. He pondered for a moment and asked tentatively, "Master Gu Yu is right. I will remember it. But why did you suddenly mention this?" True Lord Gu Yu smiled and didn't explain further. He turned and continued to walk forward, with the demeanor of a mysterious expert. Lu Chen felt a little helpless about this. The doubts in his heart grew heavier. In the end, he could only follow. In this huge underground city, it was quiet and empty. Only the two of them were walking here, and even the sound of their footsteps was especially clear. Seeing that the strange statue in the center was getting closer and closer to the murder case house, Lu Chen became a little anxious. At this moment, he suddenly heard True Lord Guyu say, "Do you know why Tianlan refused to come down himself and wanted you to accompany me down here?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "Probably because he doesn't like you." True Lord Guyu looked at him and suddenly laughed out loud. She nodded and said, "You are a little interesting." Amidst the laughter, they just happened to walk past the house. It seemed like Guyu True Monarch's attention was diverted by Lu Chen's sudden words. Who knew that when he reached the door, he turned around and without any hesitation, walked into the house naturally and straightforwardly. Lu Chen's face changed and his heart sank. True Lord Guyu stood at the door and even turned back to wave at him. She said calmly, "Come, let's go in and take a look." Lu Chen took a deep breath and tried hard to calm his racing heart. He then walked over. Real Lord Guyu walked in front with his hands behind his back, his eyes gazing at the unknown ahead. Walking leisurely, he said, "Many years ago, Tianlan once told me that he was prepared to spend the rest of his life alone, with no children, no disciples, no worries. I think this is the reason why he is unruly and does things according to his heart. Perhaps it is because of this that he was able to build such a grand foundation, doing what we old men could not do in our lifetime." Lu Chen listened quietly. At the same time, he smelled a bloody smell. It seemed that in a short period of time, the traces would not completely disappear. But now he actually accepted you as a disciple and values you so much. Maybe he wanted you to accompany me to let me understand this. True Monarch Guyu walked in front of him and stopped when he was about to enter the backyard. From his voice, it could be heard that there was a hint of sorrow. "But I am a little worried. If he has worries, will it affect the big things he wants to do? You have to know that all the things he succeeded in the past were done without burdens." True Lord Guyu slowly turned around and looked at Lu Chen, staring at him. Lu Chen's heart suddenly jumped. He forced a smile and said, "What do you mean by this?" True Lord Guyu was silent for a moment and then said calmly, "I am thinking that this matter is very important. Should I go and help this old friend?" Chapter 625. Old friend? Help him? Lu Chen almost instantly grasped the few key and subtle words in Guyu's words. It was as if a huge wave had been set off in his heart, but it was soon followed by a sudden sense of danger. Putting aside whether perfected monarch Guyu's words about being perfected monarch Tianlan's old friend or not, the last sentence about helping perfected monarch Tianlan was rather cold. It was as if she wanted perfected monarch Tianlan to return to his usual decisive and domineering self, and wanted to help him sever his ties. Lu Chen secretly swept the surroundings with the corner of his eye. Without any surprise, this place was quiet and desolate. Apart from the two of them, there was probably only the faint smell of blood in the courtyard. In such a huge underground cavern, was it a place where no one could call for help? At this moment, Lu Chen even subconsciously thought of an even more malicious thought. Was there some unspeakable deeper meaning behind perfected Lord Tianlan's insistence that he accompany perfected Lord Guyu down on his behalf? At this time, Guyu had already turned around and faced Lu Chen. Her expression was very calm, and her tone did not change. She said to Lu Chen, "What do you think of what I said just now?" Lu Chen slightly closed his eyes and suppressed the trace of irritation in his heart. He calmed his heart and smiled at Guyu, saying, "Master Guyu, you flatter me. Master's kindness towards me is as heavy as a mountain. Everything that I have today is given to me by my benefactor. My love and respect for him are even more so. However, although Master does care for me, I don't think it's to the extent that you're saying." He smiled and said, "My master is a man of great talent and strategy. He has single-handedly built up such a huge foundation. If you say that he will become weak and muddle-headed because of someone, please forgive me. I really do not dare to agree with you. Gu Yu True Lord made a sound of acknowledgement. She didn't seem to be angered by Lu Chen's sarcastic rebuttal. Instead, she nodded and said, "What you said makes some sense." Lu Chen felt slightly relieved in his heart, and then he said, "Besides that, forgive me for speaking bluntly. With the current status and prestige of my master and you, even if there are some hidden worries and mistakes, it might be possible for others to tactfully persuade you. But if someone were to overstep their authority and act arbitrarily without informing you, then I'm afraid it would instead truly infuriate you." Gu Yu pondered for a moment and actually nodded, saying, "That is indeed the case. If I were to put myself in someone else's shoes, I'd be displeased as well if someone treated me like this." He smiled at Lu Chen and said, "I didn't expect you to be so meticulous at such a young age." Lu Chen took a step back and said with a respectful expression, "I don't dare." Disciple spoke nonsense and was disrespectful. "Please forgive me, Master Gu Yu." Gu Yu looked at him quietly. After a while, he turned around and walked towards the backyard. At the same time, he said, "Let's go in and take a look." Seeing that he was no longer bothering his old friend and meddling in other people's business, Lu Chen could not help but heave a sigh of relief. However, before he could completely relax, he saw Gu Yu walk into the yard. His heart instantly jumped again. These days were really not for a person to live. Frightening, difficult, wave after wave. Even someone with a strong heart like Lu Chen felt a little overwhelmed at this time. However, he still had to face it. Lu Chen gritted his teeth and followed with large strides. At the same time, he secretly thought of a countermeasure. He was prepared to first say that he did not know anything, and when there was no other way, he would push all the blame onto that damn Baldy. In any case, that guy was the main culprit of everything. Saying anything about him was probably not wrong. Outside the tunnel entrance, True Lord Tianlon, who was looking at the sky with his hands behind his back, suddenly trembled slightly. He felt that something was wrong. Once he walked into the yard, the smell of blood in the air became much thicker. What entered his eyes, Lu Chen saw that the ground, walls, and many corners were stained with blood. Even now, there were still a lot of bloodstains left, very clearly left there. Even on the ground that had already dried up, there were many black lumps that looked disgusting and terrifying. Looking around, without much guessing, one could imagine that a lot of blood had flowed here, staining the ground and the surrounding corners red. Then, how many people had died here? Or perhaps there had been some kind of tragic and abnormal massacre here. Lu Chen asked himself. He realized that if he had not personally experienced the strange scene of White Lotus and that bloody man, he would probably have involuntarily imagined a bloody and tragic massacre. After all, there was too much blood here. But True Lord Gu Yu did not have such an experience. He came here and saw such a tragic scene. Then what would he be thinking in his heart? If he wanted to get to the bottom of this, things would be troublesome. For a moment, Lu Chen did not know what to do. At the same time, there were some doubts in his heart. Logically speaking, with that damn Baldy's intelligence, it was impossible for him to not think of this danger. But why did he let True Lord Gu Yu come down? Of course, True Lord Gu Yu was also a demigod True Lord. If he really had doubts about this underground cave and wanted to come down no matter what, there was indeed no one who could really stop him. But now, what exactly would happen? Lu Chen sneaked a glance at True Lord Gu Yu. He realized that ever since he walked into this bloody courtyard, True Lord Gu Yu had been silent. His gaze slowly swept across everything here. He looked at the ground, the walls, the corners, including the dry well in the courtyard, but he did not say a word. He just stood there quietly. After a while, he turned and said to Lu Chen, "Let's go." Left? Just like that? After True Lord Gu Yu said that, he walked straight out of the courtyard. Lu Chen looked at his back dumbfounded. But he quickly reacted and hurriedly followed. At the same time, his heart once again stirred up waves. He thought of what this True Lord had said about old friends before. Recently, the entire Sky Dragon Mountain was filled with rumors that Gu Yu and Tianlon, these two big shots, had a very unpleasant quarrel. But now, it seemed that they really were so-called old friends? If these two deity transformation stage perfected lords were secretly colluding with one another, Then just how big of a deal were they plotting? Lu Chen felt a chill in his heart as he followed the Guyu True Lord out of the house, and then saw him walking the long way back. Lu Chen's heart was filled with many questions. But at this moment, he did not dare to ask. Just like that, he followed True Lord Guyu out of the cave and returned to the surface from the entrance of the tunnel. When they came out, countless gazes landed on Guyu Perfected Monarch, both in the open and in the dark. True Lord Guyu's expression was indifferent. He looked somewhat disdainful and cold. After a cold snort, he indifferently said, "If there's nothing else, I'm leaving." With that, he waved his sleeve and his entire body rose into the air. He actually flew directly into the air and then turned into a white rainbow, flying towards the direction of Sky Dragon Mountain at lightning speed. The surroundings were silent. After a while, a hearty laughter rang out. It was True Lord Tianlan. He chuckled and said, "Lu Chen, what did I say? There's nothing in the world that can't be said to others. It's just that some people think too much and come to find trouble. Now it's ugly, isn't it?" With that, he laughed loudly. The surrounding people also laughed along with him. Only Lu Chen lowered his head. There wasn't much of a smile on his face, but a trace of palpitation flashed across his eyes. Chapter 626. The news that Supreme Guyu had aggressively gone to Fuyunji's territory to find fault with them, but returned without any results, quickly spread throughout Xianxia. Everyone was very curious about the actual situation at the time, and the description of the scene quickly spread, even though the people on that long street were almost all Fuyunji's men. This set off the old saying, "There is no such thing as an impenetrable wall," and once again proved the complicated power situation in Xianxia. Describing it as intertwined might not be entirely accurate, but it was still somewhat vivid. Interestingly, in this matter, most people didn't think that Supreme Guyu's information was fake, and thought that it was definitely the right thing to do. However, the reason why he returned without any results was because Fuyunji and Supreme Tianlan were so cunning that even a divine transformation true monarch couldn't do anything to them. Of course, there was also a small group of people who noticed that Supreme Guyu didn't enter the catacombs himself, but sent his disciple Lu Chen to follow Supreme Guyu down. Although this didn't seem to be too abrupt on the surface, as deity transformation stage perfected lords whose every move attracted the attention of tens of thousands of people, as well as the leaders of enormous forces, even the slightest of actions would be magnified by others. It was just that everyone's conclusions were sometimes different. Some people thought that Supreme Guyu was arrogant and sent his disciple to show his contempt for Supreme Guyu. Some thought that Supreme Guyu valued and trusted his disciple Lu Chen very much, and began to nurture this disciple so that he could build a relationship with other divine transformation true monarchs. However, there were also people who thought that Supreme Guyu was already dissatisfied with this disciple named Lu Chen, and began to vaguely express this to his subordinates in Fuyunji. It was even more likely that Supreme Guyu was using this method to hint to Xue Ying and other trusted subordinates of many years that they might receive news of Lu Chen's violent death in a few days. The same action could be interpreted in many different ways. This was probably because people were too smart in today's world. However, there were also people who were not affected by the waves of rumors, such as Lu Chen himself, because he felt that he was standing in the center of the storm. He saw and heard news that was far more real than outsiders. He understood the undercurrents and even the ups and downs of the waves under the calm sea, and in the near future, it would become a monstrous wave that would reach the heavens. If Perfected Guyu's words in the underground city were not enough to convince him, then after they returned to the surface, Perfected Guyu and Perfected Tianlan's short conversation, Perfected Guyu's angry departure, and especially the fact that he and Tianlan were incompatible like fire and water, yet he did not mention a word about what happened underground. All of this finally made Lu Chen completely certain that these two divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, who were enemies in everyone's eyes, had reached a tacit understanding and secretly colluded with each other. What were they going to do? What exactly was it that required people of their status and strength to secretly plot against it? The answer was almost obvious. Only other deity transformation perfected sovereigns of the same level could make a deity transformation perfected sovereign seriously plot against them. Then, to be able to make a powerful and unusually arrogant person like Tianlon willing to lower his head and secretly plot an alliance, there must be more than one deity transformation perfected sovereign he had to deal with. At the very least, it was very likely that their strength was not below his and Guyu perfected sovereigns. Then there must be 2 deity transformation perfected sovereigns, or even more? When Lu Chen thought of this, he felt a little suffocated, but very quickly, he felt a rare sense of excitement. This was a rare, or even unprecedented, legendary battle in the world. Even the bloody battle between Fuyunji and the devil cult over the years paled in comparison to this possibility. One must know that this was perhaps the pinnacle of the human cultivation world, and could easily determine the future of the human race and the direction of development. That damn Baldy was indeed an amazing person. Once he made his move, he was going to do something big. Do you think he believes me? On the way back, Lu Chen asked Old Ma, but before Old Ma could answer, he muttered to himself, "Now it seems that he probably believes me." Old Ma was a little puzzled by his muttering to himself, and asked, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen smiled but changed the topic and said, "Well, it seems that all kinds of things have to be sped up. We can't dawdle anymore. Time waits for no man." Old Ma's expression changed slightly, and he glanced at Lu Chen, subconsciously lowered his voice, and approached him, saying in a low voice, What's the situation here?" Lu Chen patted him on the shoulder and said, "I've said what I wanted to say just now." Old Ma was a little angry and said, "You bastard, why do you also learn from those officials, only saying half of what you want to say, and acting mysteriously? Can't you just tell me clearly?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "The secrets of heaven can't be revealed, otherwise it would seem that I'm not smart enough. Besides, if I say something wrong, won't I be even more embarrassed? It's just right now." Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "After you return to the immortal city, you've learned bad things." Lu Chen laughed and seemed to be in a very cheerful mood. This was one of the rare times that he looked happy recently. He told Old Ma, "You go to White Lotus's house first and help me check on her situation. Her injuries are very troublesome. In any case, she has been with us for a period of time, and we should help her as much as we can." Old Ma nodded and said, "I will go, but what about you? Aren't you going?" Lu Chen said, "Yes, I have something to do. I have to go to the Heavenly Law Hall." Old Ma was startled and said, "Heavenly Law Hall? What are you going to do there?" Lu Chen said, "To find immortal Tiehu, I have something to tell him." Old Ma frowned and wanted to say something but stopped. Lu Chen nodded and said, "I know, I have already told this matter to the damn Baldy," and he also agreed. Old Ma nodded, and the expression on his face clearly relaxed. Although he still looked a little curious and really wanted to know what Lu Chen was going to do with immortal Tiehu, in the end he actually suppressed his curiosity and turned away without saying a word. Sometimes, in this kind of Vanity Fair, the less people know, the longer they might live. Lu Chen understood Old Ma's intention, and also felt a little emotional because in the past 10 years, his life was actually similar to that of Old Ma. But after all, it was different now. He walked alone to the other side of Tianlong Mountain, and met a lot of people along the way. When they saw him, many people had different expressions on their faces, but they were all relatively polite, either because of his high position, or because of immortal Tianlon's tyrannical strength. Even if they thought that he was not going to live long and had fallen out of favor, they were still polite to him. Otherwise, why would you be angry with a dying person? So along the way, Lu Chen actually felt that his status on Tianlong Mountain seemed to have improved a lot unconsciously. After arriving at the Heavenly Law Hall, he asked someone to let him in, and before long, someone welcomed him in. When he walked outside the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall, he saw a beautiful woman standing at the door of the main hall, looking at him calmly from afar. Her appearance was charming and tender, like a blooming spring flower, and her beauty surpassed all others. It was Song Wenji. Chapter 627. Seeing Lu Chen coming over, Song Wenji gracefully walked down the stone steps to welcome him. She had a polite and joyful smile on her face, making people feel as if they were bathing in the spring breeze. Lu Chen also went up to greet her. Everyone looked at each other and smiled. The atmosphere was very harmonious and warm. Song Wenji smiled and said, "When I heard the news just now, I didn't dare to believe it. I specially asked again before I dared to believe that it is young Master Lu who has come to visit." Lu Chen also smiled and said, "Miss Song, you are too polite. I don't deserve it, I don't deserve it." Song Wenji said, "This is not something I said casually. Anyway, in my memory, you have never come to Heavenly Law Hall. Today is really a rare guest." Lu Chen said politely, "Sorry to disturb you, I have a small matter to visit Immortal Tiehu. I wonder if he has time to see me?" Song Wenji said, "Yes. But now my adoptive father has some urgent matters on hand and can't come out to see you for the time being." Lu Chen was startled for a moment, then nodded and said, I didn't expect such a coincidence. Then I will find another time to visit Immortal Tiehu." Song Wenji, however, waved her hand and said indifferently, "That's not necessary. I have already gone in to help you inform. Although adoptive father can't leave for the time being, it is not a big deal. Just wait for an hour and it will be fine. He asked me to come and greet you first. Wait for a while in the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall. He will come out in a while." Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, "In that case, I will have to trouble Miss Song." Song Wenji took a deep look at him and said with a smile, "Young Master Lu, you are treating me like an outsider. With our relationship, this is nothing." After saying that, she turned around and made a gesture of invitation, then led Lu Chen into the main hall. Lu Chen followed behind her, looking at the back of the woman from the corner of his eyes. He had some doubts in his heart. Although he and Song Wenji had interacted with each other recently, it was impossible for their friendship to be very good. Even if they had a good relationship, there were still the two supremes standing behind them. Based on the hostile atmosphere between the two deity transformation realm lords, Tianlon and Tai, who, even if the two juniors wanted to befriend them, they would have to be cautious. It could even be said that the fact that they did not turn against each other and become mortal enemies was already a sign of politeness. Song Wenji brought him into the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall. Of course, it was also Lu Chen's first time coming to this place, so he looked around curiously. In fact, as one of the most powerful places in Mount Tianlong and Zhengxianmeng, this main hall was basically on par with the Kunlun Palace. In terms of history, the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall was even older and more profound than the Kunlun Palace in Fuyunji. After all, Fuyunji was founded by Lord Tianlon, and it only rose rapidly in recent years. In the past, there was not such an unruly force in Zhengxianmeng. The nobles, that were deeply rooted in the hearts of the people, were the Heavenly Law Hall, the Starry Palace, and the Deziyuan. They were considered to have been the tripod of power since the early days of the establishment of Zhengxianmeng. Their power was intertwined and their potential could not be underestimated. Therefore, the heavy sense of a long history was also reflected in this main hall. Lu Chen saw many tall and magnificent murals on the walls of the main hall here. The murals depicted either ancient legends or some heroes and legendary lords from thousands of years ago. The sense of vicissitudes of history, the sense of heaviness, and even the sense of excitement that made people yearn for it arose spontaneously. These things could not be felt in the Kunlun Palace at all. Although in terms of size, the scale of the Kunlun Palace was much larger than the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall, and the architecture was extremely luxurious and grand. At a glance, one could see the typical style of Lord Tianlon, unscrupulous, arrogant, and the most powerful in the world. He wanted to suppress everyone in the world, even if it was a main hall. In the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall, there was no exclusive lotus throne like that of Lord Tianlon, which was as high as the seat of God or Buddha. At most, there was a large and luxurious chair placed in the center of the main hall, and the rest were ordinary tables and chairs for receiving guests. These things were not complicated. It only took Lu Chen a blink of an eye to see them clearly. Naturally, he had the same feeling in his heart. In fact, it would be fine if he did not come here because he felt that Lord Tianlan's Kunlun Palace was magnificent and looked down upon the world. However, when he came to this place with such a long history, he suddenly had a dangerous thought that it could not be a nouveau riche. That damn Baldy doesn't look like a person without a background. Even if we go back to the past, his master, Lu Chen's grandmaster, Lord Tianhong, was also a peerless lord who was famous all over the world and was a famous inheritance. In terms of connotation, there seemed to be few in the world that could be more profound than Lord Tianlan's. Why did that damn baldy give himself the temperament of a nouveau riche? Lu Chen thought and criticized in his heart. Of course, he could not show it on his face. He followed Song Wenji all the way to the seat and sat down. Someone had already served them good tea. Then Song Wenji dismissed the others, leaving only the two of them in the huge hall of Heavenly Law Hall, which seemed a little empty. "Young Master Lu, we meet alone again," Song Wenji said to Lu Chen with a smile after taking a sip of the immortal tea. Lu Chen almost choked on the tea in his mouth. After a moment of hesitation, he put down the teacup in his hand and said seriously, "Miss Song, I don't understand what you mean. We didn't specially meet alone, did we?" At the same time, Lu Chen was secretly vigilant. Although his eyes did not move, he secretly glanced around the hall with his peripheral vision, but did not find anything. Just at that moment, there was a faint warning in his heart. This was a kind of inexplicable premonition. There was no evidence to speak of, but it was unknowingly possessed by him when he was lurking in the devil cult in the past in that extremely dangerous situation. Like a lonely wild wolf, cautiously facing the world full of dangers. In a secret corner of the hall of Heavenly Law Hall, separated by a thick wall, at this moment, Immortal Tiehu, who was supposed to be dealing with a small but urgent matter and therefore could not leave to make Lu Chen wait for a while, was sitting in a secret chamber behind the wall. There was a strange mirror shimmering with a strange light. It was unknown what kind of strange ability had been set up on it, but it actually reflected the scene of Song Wenji and Lu Chen sitting across from each other in the hall. Not only was the image extremely clear, even their voices were transmitted here without a single error. Immortal Tiehu looked indifferently at Lu Chen on the image, listening to his words. Although Song Wenji did not notice, he could tell that Lu Chen was observing the surroundings. His white eyebrows twitched, then he suddenly sneered and said to himself, "He is indeed a top-notch shadow master. He can actually detect my presence." He pondered for a moment, then suddenly picked up a piece of jade and said in a deep voice, "Ask him why he is here." In the image, Song Wenji's body paused for a moment, then smiled at Lu Chen and said, "Young Master Lu, today you specially came to find my Yifu, what is it for?" Chapter 628. At that moment, Lu Chen's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Although Song Wenji in front of him looked normal, he still felt that this woman seemed to have paused for a moment. However, that moment was too short. Perhaps it was an illusion. Therefore, Lu Chen did not show any more hesitation. After a smile, he said frankly, "Actually, before I returned to the Immortal City, I met a person. He asked me to pass a message to Immortal Taihu. I came here today to pass this message. There's nothing else." Pass a message? Song Wenji seemed to have not expected Lu Chen's reason for coming here. She was startled for a moment. After a while, she smiled and said, "To be able to trouble Immortal Tianlan's only disciple, young Master Lu, to pass a message, this person's identity must be extraordinary, right?" Lu Chen nodded and said with a smile, "It's all right. However, I feel that a person who is qualified to talk to someone like Uncle Master Tai who shouldn't be too bad." That's true. Song Wenji seemed to have thought of this as well. She laughed in a self-mocking manner, and then her charming gaze swept across Lu Chen's face. Her expression was gentle like ripples of water as she said softly, "Then who exactly is this person? I wonder if young Master Lu can tell me?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said seriously, "Miss Song, it's not that I want to be disrespectful to you. However, the person who entrusted this to you did not say that his name can be passed on to others. How about this? When Uncle Master Tai who arrives later, I will report this matter to him and then leave. As for how he will deal with this matter, I can't be a busybody." He smiled and said, "When the time comes, you can ask Uncle Master Taihu. With the close relationship between you and your daughter, and Uncle Master Taihu's love for you, I believe he will tell you everything he knows." Song Wenji's expression changed slightly, not because Lu Chen didn't want to tell her the identity of the messenger, but because the man in front of her mentioned intimate relationship, love, and other words in his last words. Perhaps she was paranoid, or perhaps she thought too much, but she felt that it was a little harsh, as if Lu Chen was referring to something else. But when she looked carefully at Lu Chen's face again, she found that this person's expression was the same as usual, and the tone of his voice had not changed at all. There was no sarcasm in his words at all. Could it be that he was thinking too much? There were some things that would leave a guilty conscience in one's heart. Even if one was wearing a warm and soft skin, one would still be afraid of being mentioned. For some things, even if one had an excuse, one would still feel ashamed. It was like the deepest wound that couldn't be healed, always dripping with blood as it cut into his heart. Just a touch would cause him pain. Some people would become numb to the pain after a long time, slowly getting used to it. Then this kind of thing would no longer matter to him, and the wound would slowly be covered up. But there were also some people, although everything was so outstanding on the outside, but their hearts could never pass that hurdle and would sink into this painful abyss for a long time. Song Wenji stared at Lu Chen, her eyes bright, sharp but no longer clear. Lu Chen felt it, and also raised his head to look at her. After a while he asked softly, "Miss Song, what's wrong?" Song Wenji was silent for a while, shook her head and said, "Nothing." "Ha!" When the tea in the cup was slightly cold, a burst of bright and clear laughter suddenly came from the depths of the Hall of Heavenly Justice. After hearing this voice, Lu Chen and Song Wenji both stood up and turned to look in that direction. After a while, Tiehu Supreme walked over with vigorous steps, in high spirits, full of energy, as if he had encountered some happy event, and was very happy. Along the way, he waved to Lu Chen and said with a smile, "Little Lu, it's rare for you to come to my place, a rare guest, a rare guest." Lu Chen revealed a respectful expression, bowed politely, and then said with a smile, "I have some matters to attend to, and have disturbed Sherba's cultivation. It's really a sin." Tiehu Supreme waved his hand indifferently, then walked to his throne and sat down, and signaled for Lu Chen to sit down and talk. And at this time, Song Wenji smiled and personally went to serve tea, poured a cup for Tiehu Supreme, and changed the tea for Lu Chen. After Lu Chen thanked Lu Chen, Tiehu Supreme looked especially gentle and kind today, and said to Lu Chen with a smile, "Little Lu, if you have time in the future, come visit me more often, don't stand on ceremony." To be honest, among all the disciples under the immortals in Zhengxianmeng, I think you are the most promising. The others don't look like they will be able to achieve anything. Lu Chen was shocked, and quickly stood up, and said with a smile, "Sherbua, you flatter me, I don't deserve it. Many senior brothers in the Immortal Allies have been famous for many years, their cultivation is profound, and their prestige is great. I am still far from them." Tiehu Supreme snorted and said, "But they are all useless, what's the use?" He looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "But you are different. Brother Tianlan has the most sharp eyes in the world. Those who can be chosen by him must be outstanding geniuses." As he spoke, he sighed and continued, "To think that our Hall of Heavenly Law will have no successor in the future, this old man is truly disappointed." When Lu Chen came here, he never thought that Tiehu Supreme would have such a high evaluation of him. He was really caught unprepared, and didn't know what to say for a moment. Of course, he would not take the words of this big boss seriously, but he secretly criticized in his heart, thinking that these immortals of Huashan realm were all as cunning as old foxes, too difficult to deal with, and he would be fooled if he was not careful. After praising Lu Chen, Tiehu Supreme did not even ask Lu Chen why he came, but just smiled and said to him, "By the way, how is your master these days, is he well?" Lu Chen was slightly shocked, and at that moment his mind involuntarily had some thoughts, but he immediately replied, "Thank you for your concern, Sherbua. Master is in good health. Before I came here, he asked me to send his regards to you." Tiehu Supreme's eyes slightly narrowed, and then he nodded. His expression seemed to be a little lighter, but he was still very polite to Lu Chen. After a few more words, he asked Lu Chen, "Little Lu, what brings you here today?" Lu Chen secretly heaved a sigh of relief, thinking that after going through so much trouble, he finally got to the point. At the beginning, he said a lot of things in a roundabout way, which always made people feel that there was a hidden meaning in his words, as if he was trying to get information from him. He coughed, stood up, and said seriously, "Yes, the thing is, before I returned to the Immortal City, I once passed by the Great Snow Mountain in the Lost Land." As he said this, his eyes stared at Tiehu Supreme, carefully watching the change of expression on the face of this immortal of Huashan realm. As expected, when he mentioned the 3 words, Great Snow Mountain, Tiehu Supreme's expression suddenly changed. It really was him. Lu Chen's heart calmed down, and then he said, "In the Great Snow Mountain, I actually met an ancient divine beast, Heavenly Wolf. It was this divine beast that asked me to pass a message to you. It only said, 'The leaf that I borrowed years ago, it is time to return it.'" After saying this, his eyes lit up, and he looked directly at Tiehu Supreme, wanting to see how he would react. Chapter 629. White Lotus put on a coat and sat by the window, staring blankly at the scenery outside the window. Although it was called a scenery, it was actually just a sky with a few trees. Of course, there was a beautiful scenery on Sky Dragon Mountain, but it was not here. Generally speaking, the best places would be taken by the most powerful true monarchs. The house was very quiet, without a sound. Originally, there was a black dog lying outside the house. Even though there was a door between them, they could occasionally hear its movements. Perhaps it could even give people a sense of life. But now that Atsu had been taken away by Lu Chen, the house was completely deserted. White Lotus held her chin with her hand, and her eyes seemed to be a little blank. Perhaps it was because she was too lonely in this lonely and deserted environment, so there was even a little emptiness in her eyes. No one knew what she was thinking at the moment. Was she recalling the past, thinking about some doubts, or simply sitting there in a daze? After an unknown amount of time, suddenly there was a sound of footsteps coming from outside the house, approaching the door from afar. After a while, someone knocked on the door. It was Old Ma's voice. "White Lotus, are you in the house?" White Lotus slowly turned her head and glanced at the door. After a while, she said, "The door is not locked. Come in by yourself." There was a moment of silence outside the door, and then there was a creak. Old Ma pushed the door open and walked in. The tall black dog followed him into the house. Old Ma swept a glance around the room before his gaze finally fell on Bai Lian, who was sitting by the window. A smile appeared on his face as he asked, "Why are you sitting up? Is your body feeling better?" White Lotus smiled, but her eyes fell on Atsu, who was standing next to Old Ma. Unlike Old Ma, who was looking around when he came in, Atsu stared at White Lotus as soon as he came in. The eyes of a person and a dog met in midair. After a moment, White Lotus looked away and said to Old Ma, "I'm fine, and I've been lying down for a long time. I want to sit up." Well, Old Ma didn't think much of it. He walked over and moved a chair to sit down. "Lu Chen is busy, but he still remembers you, so he asked me to come over and see if you are better. If there is anything you need my help with, just tell me." White Lotus shook her head and said, I'm fine. Old Ma moved his fat body on the chair and asked curiously, "How did you get hurt? Why did you suddenly cause such a big trouble? Can you tell me?" White Lotus glanced at him and asked, "Didn't Lu Chen tell you?" Old Ma was stunned for a moment and said, "No." White Lotus said, "It seems that he doesn't keep everything from you." After a pause, she looked at Old Ma, whose face was a little gloomy, and said lightly, "Actually, I don't know. I only remember that I followed Lu Chen to the underground city, and then I lost consciousness. I can't remember what happened after that, but when I woke up, I was probably here." Oh. Old Ma didn't say anything more. Or perhaps he wasn't particularly familiar with this girl, so he didn't have anything to say. After dawdling for a while, the atmosphere became a little awkward, so Old Ma quickly found an excuse to get up and leave. However, just as he was about to leave the room, he suddenly stopped in his tracks as if he had something to say. White Lotus felt his movement and looked over. Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said to White Lotus, "Lu Chen isn't a bad person, at least he's a good friend. He's done everything he can for you. Don't blame him." White Lotus stared at him for a moment, and her expression gradually eased. She nodded and said, "I know." Old Ma chuckled and turned to leave. Suddenly he heard White Lotus say, "Actually, you're also a good friend. Does Lu Chen know that?" Old Ma paused for a moment, but he didn't look back. Then he walked out of the door and left. Atsu followed him and left. When he left, he looked back and stared at White Lotus fiercely and vigilantly. It seemed that the relationship between this black dog and this girl was always inexplicably tense. Old Ma and Atsu left after the somewhat routine greeting, and the room quickly returned to its original cold and cheerless state. White Lotus walked over and closed the door. After thinking for a moment, she locked it. Just that when she silently turned around, preparing to walk back to the bed, her vision suddenly blurred. Just behind her, in this cold and lonely room, a huge and tall figure suddenly appeared, like a mountain peak standing behind her, and then looked down at her from above. It was a huge and burly bald man in a loose robe. Just by standing there quietly, he already looked like a god. This room was surrounded by walls, and probably only connected to the outside world through the window and the door. But judging from the size of the door frame, it was impossible for this bald man to enter and exit freely, not to mention the smaller window. How did he enter this room? How did he manage to stand behind White Lotus without a sound? At that moment, White Lotus felt goosebumps all over her body. Her face turned pale and her body began to tremble. It was as if she had subconsciously taken a step back, wanting to escape from this place, but in her panic, this indifferent and emotionless true Lord Tianlan suddenly stretched out his hand. His movements did not seem fast, as if he was calmly extending his hand to greet her. However, White Lotus's eyes were filled with despair. Her entire body seemed to be bound by an invisible force, trembling uncontrollably. She watched helplessly as the hand reached for her face, and then, as if it was teasing her, grabbed her chin and lifted it up a little. She seemed to have lost all the strength and courage to resist when facing true Lord Tianlan. Her whole body trembled, and her face was lifted high. There was even a look of fear in her eyes. True Lord Tianlan looked at her with great interest. He stared at her for a while, thought for a moment, and then nodded. "You seem to be very afraid?" He calmly asked White Lotus. This sentence sounded very gentle and quiet, not like the cruelty of an old cat catching a mouse. But White Lotus seemed to be even more afraid. Her body trembled and she couldn't speak. True Lord Tianlan didn't seem to care about this at all. His thick fingers caressed White Lotus' delicate and fair face as if he was touching a rare treasure. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said to her, "The method of blood food originated from the southern border barbarian witchcraft which had been passed down for a long time. Later on, those trash of the devil cult took it and slightly improved it. It looks like it can be used, but in fact, there are a lot of hidden dangers in it. It looks scary and powerful, but in fact, it's a broken thing that can't even be shown in public." "You actually treat this thing as a treasure?" he said with a smile, looking at the girl in front of him like a wolf. Chapter 630. White Lotus's face had lost all color. It was unknown whether it was because her body was too weak after the injury or because she was too frightened at this moment. Her body trembled violently. It seemed that she wanted very much to retreat and escape from Supreme Lord Tianlan's terrifying palm. However, all her strength seemed to have left her at this moment, making her like a pitiful and helpless ant. She could only wail in despair in the giant's palm, unable to even struggle. The world was always like this. The law of the jungle had long become the norm. Even some gentle and compassionate people would unknowingly follow this rule. We revere and worship the strong, despise and ignore the weak. Perhaps we would occasionally pity those who were in miserable circumstances, but in fact, we forgot that most of the compassion was not in our hearts. Out of sight, there were even more weak people who were not seen. Perhaps after seeing them, everyone was used to it. Even those who were kind-hearted couldn't think of mercy. They were like lions that were strutting with their heads held high, and would never look at ants that were trampled to death by their feet. How could there be compassion? Or rather, could there really be compassion in the heart of a person like Supreme Lord Tianlan? White Lotus looked at him mournfully, her eyes full of fear and pleading. It was a fear that came from the depths of her soul. It was her body's instinctive desire to live. She wanted to live. She did not want to die. For this, she could give up everything and give up everything. Her eyes clearly and plainly expressed her thoughts, but Supreme Lord Tianlan was not moved. Perhaps to a giant like him who had stood at the peak for too long, these so-called desires and the so-called price to pay were just a joke to him. He threw them away like they were old shoes. He did not care about them at all. Of course, there were things that he valued, but they were not on White Lotus. Therefore, he smiled coldly and ruthlessly. After a trace of disgust flashed across his eyes, he probably saw what he hated about the devil cult and touched the thread in his heart. His palm slowly moved down from White Lotus's chin. White Lotus's body began to tremble violently. She could clearly feel the rough skin brushing past her smooth neck before stopping in the middle of her neck. The bald giant looked at her indifferently. The giant palm that seemed to be able to destroy everything began to slowly tighten, violently and forcefully squeezing out all the aura in her body. Her heart received the painful reflex of her body and became angry. It began to beat violently, desperately trying to transfer the dark red blood to her head. However, when it reached her neck, it was as if it had encountered an impenetrable dam, and it stopped moving. White Lotus's feet went soft, and then she was in the air. Her body had already left the ground. She was grabbed by the neck and raised into the air. Her vision began to blur, and her feet began to kick wildly. Before the last bit of sober consciousness disappeared, White Lotus sadly found that she was actually too afraid to attack this person in such a situation. But he couldn't do it either. The aura of life was rapidly fading, and the world gradually darkened. Her mind gradually became blank. At a certain moment, a song from a long time ago suddenly echoed in her mind. It seemed to be a song related to the albizia flower. She wanted to sing, but she couldn't. She didn't know why, but some fragmented images suddenly flashed through her mind, like fragments of memories that had long been lost. In that daze, she seemed to see a kind woman hugging her and kissing her. White Lotus desperately wanted to see that face clearly, but it was always blurred. Suddenly, a huge black shadow fell from the sky, took everything away, destroyed everything, and smashed the only figure that she felt warm into pieces. Then, like a mountain, it turned around and slowly walked towards her. Her vision went black, and she fainted, completely losing consciousness. The room was quiet. True Lord Tianlan indifferently looked at the girl in his hand who was slowly lowering her head. With the last bit of strength left, he could completely destroy this budding life. As long as he used a little more strength on his fingers. As long as he tightened the gap between his palms. Even he himself knew that he didn't need to go through so much trouble from the beginning. He could have easily crushed this woman with a finger, instead of torturing people like those trash from the devil cult. But he still didn't do it immediately. He suddenly felt that he was a bit like a member of the devil cult. This thought made True Lord Tianlan a little unhappy, but he still didn't let go. At this moment, a sudden sound of footsteps came from outside the room. A moment later, a familiar voice came in. It was Lu Qin. White Lotus, are you okay? True Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment, then he threw White Lotus away like throwing a rag. With a bang, White Lotus's body fell unconscious and fell to the ground, knocking over a table and making a loud noise. The outside of the room instantly quieted down. But what followed was not the expected scene of someone breaking the door and entering. Instead, it was silent, as if Lu Chen's voice was just a hallucination of the wind and no one had come here at all. True Lord Tianlan tilted his head and glanced at the door. Then his eyes slowly swept across the wall, sweeping across some unknown places on the wall. The corners of his mouth suddenly revealed a trace of a smile, as if his mood had suddenly improved, as if he had seen something that he liked and was satisfied with. He quietly stood in the room, gazing at the surrounding walls, and then patiently waited. At the corner of the wall about 7 feet away from the door, there was suddenly a very soft sound. It was so soft that it was almost inaudible, as if someone had carelessly touched the wall. But True Lord Tianlan's eyes were already one step ahead of it, staring at that place. He stood quietly. If he wanted to, perhaps he could make it so that not a single trace of his aura leaked out. He could turn invisible and empty, or he could transform into anything, making people think that it was a table, a chair, or a bed and not arousing any suspicion. But he didn't. He just smiled and looked at the corner, casually not controlling his own aura. The sound in the corner instantly went silent. Like a vigilant wolf that had sensed some unknown threat in the darkness, even though there was an urgent bait in front of him, he still forced himself to endure it. The sound outside the room quieted down, followed by a faintly discernible killing intent. Inside the room, True Lord Tianlan's eyes became increasingly bright. His gaze began to drift again, looking at the four walls, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. It seemed that no matter how the person outside the room moved, they could not escape his perception. And that terrifying aura locked the person outside the room, making that killing intent thicker and thicker, as if it was about to explode. Chapter 631. It was quiet inside and outside the house. The only thing that could be felt was the invisible tension that was getting tenser and tenser. Supreme Lord Tianlan was still as calm as the ocean. Other than scanning the surrounding walls and following the occasional strange and light sounds that came from outside the house, he did not do anything else. However, the murderous aura outside the house was getting stronger and stronger. It was like the raging waves of an enraged ocean, each wave stronger than the one before it. The invisible waves seemed to be rising higher and higher, as if they would rush into the house in the next moment, drown and destroy everything here. However, the house was still there. The waves of almost hallucinatory murderous aura filled the surroundings but did not cause any substantial movement. Standing in the house, Supreme Lord Tianlan suddenly lowered his head and took a look. The wide sleeves of his robe fluttered slightly even though there was no wind. The admiration in his eyes grew stronger, and he even nodded slightly. At the same time, the murderous aura around him had almost reached its peak inside and outside the house. It was as if a huge wave had rushed up to the sky and gathered into an incomparably huge peak. Just as it was about to crash down and explode all the forces in the house, time suddenly seemed to freeze at that moment. All the murderous aura suddenly disappeared completely, as if someone had woken up from a dream. Everything was just an illusion and disappeared without a trace. At the moment when the heavy hammer was about to fall, at the moment when the violent force was about to explode, everything suddenly disappeared. It was really quiet outside the house. There was no sound, no movement, not even the invisible murderous aura. Everything became empty as if nothing had ever existed. It was as if what happened just now was just an inadvertent illusion of Supreme Lord Tianlan. The house was still very quiet. White Lotus was still lying on the ground, and it was unknown whether she was dead or alive. Supreme Lord Tianlan was still standing there alone. His wide sleeves made him look up to him like a majestic mountain. His expression was still calm, without any shock or sorrow. Of course, there were no emotions like fear or dread. However, the smile on his lips faded, and the gratification and admiration in his eyes faded. He stared at the wall. Although there were bricks in the way, it seemed that he could still see through it. Even though he was a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, at this moment, he could still clearly feel the terrifying difference. The violent moment suddenly turned into nothingness. It was a power that seemed invisible but could affect the soul. It was a level beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. It was a rare and profound will to reign in the horse at the edge of life and death. He was indeed the most outstanding shadow. In the end, he still remembered that the shadow's greatest strength was not the vastness of the raging waves, but the soundless glimmer of light in the dark shadows. He lurked in the shadows. When he was not in sight, he was always indescribably terrifying, even for a soul formation perfected cultivator. Yes, at this moment, perfected Lord Tianlan truly felt threatened for the first time. That was the disciple that he admired the most, trusted the most, and had placed the highest hopes on. He was a good disciple that he had personally taught. His gaze was somewhat cold. Lu Chen, who was outside the house, had used some weird secret method to completely conceal his aura like a ghost at this moment. Supreme Lord Tianlan could feel that Lu Chen should still be somewhere outside the house, But for the first time, he lost control of Lu Chen's exact location. This was a very rare thing for him. Of course, this was also because he had secretly suppressed his own cultivation. He was an extremely powerful person. As long as he released his senses without any scruples, it was almost impossible for anyone near him to hide their traces. However, under such a powerful and magnificent aura, ordinary cultivators might not be able to sense it, but in the eyes of the shadow, who had gone through special and harsh training, he was like a blazing sun. It was impossible to hide his identity. However, he still did not want Lu Chen to know that he was here at this moment. He was still a little curious about this disciple of his. He wanted to know what kind of abilities and trump cards this man, who had many fetters with him and appeared to be gentle and respectful but was actually arrogant and unruly in the depths of his heart, had. He really wanted to see. Therefore, he still stood quietly and waited patiently, waiting for the shadow to strike with the breath of death that he did not know when would come amidst the silence. For a moment, a somewhat strange thought suddenly flashed across his mind. He thought of many years ago in that desolate valley, when the ancient magic formation was activated by the elders of the devil cult, and when the shadow that had been hiding for many years appeared behind them and delivered the final fatal blow. What did those people feel? Would there be a day when he would also experience such a state of mind? He waited patiently, as if he did not care about life or anything else, and was only left with curiosity. The silence outside the house seemed to last for a very long time, but it also seemed like a blink of an eye. In that tense and empty atmosphere, there seemed to be an invisible force constantly attacking one's mind and perception, constantly producing all kinds of illusions. Then, after the silence that made one feel lost and silent, suddenly, a voice rang out from somewhere on the wall. It was extremely soft, almost the same as before, as if someone had touched the wall with his fingers. There was almost no sound at all, except for a terrifying figure like Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze instantly shifted over. At that moment, his perception was immediately magnified, and almost in the blink of an eye, he caught the breath that had suddenly disappeared. His lips curled into a smile again, and his expression became gentle once more. He looked like an adult looking at a stubborn child who was playing around, with a bit of affection. However, at this moment, suddenly, on the opposite wall from where the voice had just come from, the wall that Perfected Lord Tianlan's back was facing, a sound also rang out. It was extremely soft, and almost inaudible, except for figures like Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression instantly froze, and he almost subconsciously looked back with a bit of astonishment. However, when he turned his head halfway, he frowned, as if he had sensed something, and his body suddenly froze. At that moment, it was as if the world had stopped, and time had frozen for a moment. Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure stood alone in the house. There seemed to be a gust of wind blowing outside the house, and in the house with its doors and windows tightly shut, his large sleeve seemed to flutter slightly. Time was like a surging river, and someone was faintly looking at him from the depths of the river. In the crack of time and space, the bald man also seemed to be looking sideways, staring at the place where the invisible light and shadow intersected. He seemed to be looking at himself, but it also seemed like it wasn't him. Perhaps it was just his past and future self, who knew? Then he suddenly raised his head, as if he had beaten time to it. The moment his head turned, it was as if a force had suddenly shattered the peace, completely destroying the disorderly illusion, making the bald man seem to have beaten time to it. He raised his head and looked over. Boom! A loud sound rang out, and dust flew everywhere. The two walls that had echoed the sound were fine, but above his head, there was a huge hole in the roof. Someone descended from the sky, and his killing intent was like a tide, bursting forth violently. With a suffocating momentum, he went straight for his head. Chapter 632. It was as if a stormy sea had rolled up a raging wave, crashing down from above. The sound of the wind was so strong that it seemed as if the house was about to be torn apart. The violent wind blew everything in the house to the left and right. Even White Lotus, who had fainted on the ground, was blown away a few times. The wind rolled up into a whirlpool, whistling and surging. However, in the eye of the storm, the tall and burly man still stood there. Although his sleeves were also fluttering, his body was towering and unmoving. His face was calm and indifferent, and his gaze seemed to be deep and distant, hiding an unknown emotion. In the fierce wind, perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the sky. His pupils reflected the figure descending from the sky. That figure was very familiar. The violent storm blew his clothes, but it could not shake his body in the slightest. However, for some reason, his body, which was as heavy and solid as a mountain, did not move an inch at this moment. In that moment of life and death, he still quietly raised his head and looked up, without the slightest movement. It seemed that he was caught unprepared. Or was he waiting for death? Or was he helpless? The storm was like a wild horse that had escaped its reins, wreaking havoc in the house. The murderous shadow hidden behind the fierce wind had not hesitated at all from the beginning. As soon as it rushed into the house, it immediately pounced on its target, using the fiercest killing move with the fiercest murderous intent. The storm that filled the sky seemed to have become its follower, whistling and converging into a fearsome and terrifying force. In the depths of the shadow, Lu Chen's face was faintly discernible. His whole body was like a sharp blade, stabbing straight down. The black dagger that he once owned was now gone. It had been destroyed by perfected Lord Tianlan. Now, there was a strange black fire flashing on Lu Chen's body. Even his eyes seemed to be burning with two balls of fire. In the blink of an eye, the two men seemed to be very close to each other. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up, as if he had not reacted to the fatal attack that was falling from the sky and could split his head open. Lu Chen was majestic and boundless, but at that moment he finally saw the person below clearly. The bald man. The man who was looking up. Should he really continue with this attack? Would this strike be the only chance in his life to kill this damn Baldy? The darned Baldy was so powerful and terrifying that it was almost impossible for one to reach the soul formation perfected Lord Realm through hard work alone. What better opportunity could there be than this? In a one-on-one battle, he seemed to have the absolute upper hand. He saw perfected Lord Tianlan's face. It was so short that he didn't even have time to judge whether this person was at a loss or not. Or was it just a trap, a test? Once again, a fork in the road of life appeared in front of him. He had to make a choice. If he made the wrong choice, he would fall into the abyss and die without a burial. The wind howled, and that moment seemed to last for an eternity. Supreme Tianlan stared at the figure descending from the sky. Looking at the familiar face in the shadow behind the storm, he wondered if he would stab him with a fatal blow. He remembered that morning many years ago, when the sun was very warm, he found the boy in the alley and took him away. That morning he held the boy's hand. Although the boy was usually fierce and cunning, he was very obedient that day. Maybe he had that special ability since he was young, or maybe life had taught him survival skills. If he had to die, was it also a reincarnation and karma to die in the hands of the child he had taught? Those secrets hidden in his heart would probably disappear forever. There was even a smile on his lips. He squinted his eyes and looked at the murderous figure in the air. Then he made eye contact with the man in the wind. At that moment he actually felt that time was very, very slow. Then he suddenly heard a muffled groan from the sky. The wind suddenly whistled mournfully, but the murderous intent in the storm suddenly dissipated. Then he clearly saw Lu Chen's face suddenly change from the condensed murderous intent to a hint of surprise, and then suddenly turned red. It was as if all the blood in his body had suddenly rushed to his face and head. His body fell rapidly from the air and suddenly twisted in an extremely twisted position. Then, Lu Chen's whole body flew out. While he was still in midair, Lu Chen's body made a few deep cracking sounds, as if a few of his bones had been forcibly broken by a powerful force. Immediately after, his body suddenly arched, his head jerked back in midair, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. A moment later, with a boom, Lu Chen's body heavily smashed into the wall beside him. In an instant, the bricks of the wall cracked and dust flew everywhere. The house also trembled and made rustling sounds, looking like it was about to collapse. Perfected Lord Tianlan silently stood where he was, his eyes fixed on the figures struggling under the messy ruins. A light flickered in the depths of his eyes. After a moment, he slowly walked up to Lu Qin, who was lying on the ground and coughing violently with his hand on his chest. There was a painful expression on Lu Qin's face. Anyone who had a few bones broken and had their meridians devoured by an extremely fierce force would not feel good. If it were an ordinary person, he would probably have fainted by now. But Lu Qin did not. He panted heavily and finally calmed down a little. Then, he raised his head and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan, who was standing silently in front of him. After a moment, a smile suddenly appeared on his bloody face. Then, with a hint of mockery, he scolded, "F***cf, damn baldy." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at this young man and opened his mouth. It seemed that even someone as wise as him did not expect to hear such words at this time. For a moment, he did not know what to say. But for some reason, he was not angry. On the contrary, his gaze even softened a little. He squatted down his tall and burly body and approached Lu Qin. After a moment of silence, he looked at his face that was stained by blood and dust and said, "You must have wanted to scold me for a long time, right?" Lu Qin nodded and said, "Yes, since the day you threw me into the devil cult." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. He reached out and patted Lu Qin's shoulder. Then he casually lifted Lu Qin up and threw him on his back. Lu Qin let out a muffled groan as if he had hit a sore spot. His body trembled, but apart from this sound, he did not say a word and endured it. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not say anything else. Just like that, he carried Lu Qin and walked out of the room, leaving the ruins behind him. He did not even care about the White Lotus who was lying in the dust, dead or alive. Just like that, he left this place with his only disciple. A line of warm blood flowed down his lapel. He looked down and said, "Your blood is still warm?" Lu Qin leaned on his shoulder. His breath sounded weak and painful. After a while, he said, "Of course." Chapter 633. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not hide his tracks when he left. It seemed as if nothing had happened as he walked calmly as if nothing had happened. Of course, he was carrying the pale and haggard-looking Lu Qin on his back. After he walked out of the door and took 5 or 6 steps forward, a sudden roar came from behind him. It sounded like a cry of despair or a sigh of frustration. Then there was a cracking sound. Dozens of cracks appeared on the brick walls of the house and spread rapidly. Then, with a loud roar, the whole house collapsed. Dust and gravel flew into the air. It was a rather spectacular sight. However, perfected Lord Tianlan did not even turn back to look. He just walked calmly and slowly. Such a huge commotion naturally alerted the surroundings. Moreover, this was Fuyunji's territory. As the most vigilant and powerful hall in Xianxia, the people here moved the fastest. Not long after, many people rushed out of the surrounding houses. Some of them looked vigilant, some of them were disheveled. It was unknown what they were doing in the houses. Further away, more people were rushing over from all directions. The expressions of the people who were the fastest to arrive were the first to change, looking extremely shocked. They immediately stopped and stood to the side. Some of the more impatient ones who arrived later shouted angrily, "Who is so bold? How dare you?" When he saw the scene in front of him clearly, he choked on his words as if he had eaten a raw duck egg. He looked shocked and took a few steps back, looking as if he had seen a ghost. More and more people appeared in the surroundings and then quietly stood to the side to watch. At the same time, a strange emotion also spread in the crowd. None of the people here were fools. They only believed what they saw with their own eyes. Lu Qin, young Master Lu, was injured for some unknown reason. However, perfected Lord Tianlan did not care about bloodshed and personally carried this disciple. They were like father and son. The rumors that had been secretly spreading in the past disappeared at this moment. Their relationship seemed to be unbreakable and indestructible. If there was a need to choose a side, there was no longer any need to think about it. Everyone consciously kept a distance from perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin and looked at the master and disciple with complicated feelings. At the same time, many people secretly looked in another direction. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked forward. His body was tall and sturdy, but his steps were unusually steady. At the same time, Lu Chen suddenly heard his deep and sonorous voice. "I've destroyed that black sword. Now that I think about it, it's a pity." Lu Chen raised his head slightly and glanced at him without saying a word. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said in a low voice, "Perhaps he can really injure me." Lu Chen closed his eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan was not offended. He thought for a moment and said, "How did you manage to make a sound on 2 walls at the same time when you were outside the house?" Just as Lu Chen was about to say something, the two of them suddenly sensed something and turned to look at the collapsed house together. They saw a stone being pushed away from the rubble. Then, a black figure jumped out and stood on the spot, shaking with all its might. Immediately, a cloud of dust rose. It was Black Dog. Lu Chen did not say anything, but Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and nodded. "This dog is not bad." Lying on Perfected Lord Tianlan's shoulder, Lu Chen walked through the crowd. Suddenly, he saw a familiar figure standing in the crowd not far away. The person was looking at him with surprise and a little doubt. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. Then he waved at the fat man and said, "Old Ma, come here for a moment." In the crowd, Old Ma was startled. The people around him immediately dispersed, leaving him alone. Old Ma smiled awkwardly and had no choice but to walk forward. Apparently, Perfected Lord Tianlan had no intention of stopping for Old Ma and continued to walk his own path. Even if Old Ma was 10 times more courageous, he would not dare to argue with Perfected Lord Tianlan. Therefore, he could only blindly follow behind Perfected Lord Tianlan. Then he slightly bent down and approached Lu Chen. With a sad face and a little nervous, he said, "My little ancestor, what are you doing?" Lu Chen coughed and pointed to the back. Then he said, "White Lotus is still in that house. She was buried under the rubble. I don't know whether she is dead or alive. You can go and have a look." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look back, but at this moment he slightly raised his eyebrows. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. No one knew what had happened in that house. However, when he peeked at Perfected Lord Tianlan, he found that this big shot had no intention of saying anything. Old Ma could only grit his teeth and nodded to Lu Chen. "I see." Lu Chen hummed in acknowledgement. He seemed to still be a little worried, so he added, "If she's dead, we'll bury her. If she's still alive, we'll try our best to save her. After all, she's someone we know." "Oh," Old Ma agreed. Then, he turned back and strode toward the house. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked a few steps forward with Lu Chen on his back. Suddenly, he said, "Just an acquaintance?" Lu Chen said, "That's it." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded expressionlessly. Then he left with Lu Chen on his back. After the two protagonists left, the surrounding crowd gradually dispersed. Only Old Ma was left standing in front of the pile of collapsed houses, speechless for a moment. He stood there for a moment and looked around. However, he found that no one came over. It seemed that everyone was very smart and did not want to get involved in this matter, which was likely to cause trouble for them. Therefore, he was the only one who was unlucky. Old Ma sighed and lowered his head to turn over the broken stones and bricks. Next to him, Atsu probably saw that Lu Chen was carried away by Perfected Lord Tianlan. It stayed where it was and did not follow Lu Chen. It was probably because this dog had always been in awe of the bald Perfected Lord and was unwilling to approach him. However, even if it stayed where it was, Atsu obviously had no intention of helping Old Ma. It took a few steps to the side, jumped on a stone, and lay on it. Then, it lazily watched Old Ma work like a laborer. Although Old Ma was fat, he was still a cultivator and had some cultivation. Therefore, he worked much faster than ordinary people. Soon, he turned over a lot of broken bricks and found White Lotus lying in a cloud of dust. Looking at White Lotus lying on the ground, covered with dust, Old Ma was shocked and hurried to check her breath. After a while, a warm breath came from his fingertips. Old Ma heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he stared at the girl whose beautiful face was mostly covered by dust, shook his head, and said to himself, "You also have a hard life. In fact, it's very tiring to live, but who wants to die?" When he said the last sentence, his voice was very soft, as if he had been touched by something. Chapter 634. If Xianxia was the most powerful organization in the world and gathered the greatest power in the world, then the Immortal City and the Celestial Dragon Mountain were the biggest stage in the world. On this incomparably huge stage, for thousands of years, scenes of joys and sorrows of the human world, countless plots of power and intrigue had happened here. There were even more treacherous and strange things that happened in the dark places where the sun couldn't shine and were not known by most people. It was like a pagoda of slaughter stacked layer by layer. Everyone had their own position and height, and they could only know things at their level. However, there was one thing that everyone understood and knew. The higher they went, the higher they stood, the bigger the things they knew and the greater the benefits they could obtain. No one was willing to be ordinary. In the Immortal City, the world's largest Vanity Fair, the most realistic and most yearning tower of power, everyone desperately wanted to climb up. Mediocre people who had no desire to struggle, no perseverance, and no ambition had long been swept away here. In this huge city where everyone preached justice, fairness, and benevolence, there were actually not many people who really believed in these beautiful words. Lu Chen did not believe in these beautiful words. He came from the outside world that was a little dark and shadowy. In the beginning, he always felt a little out of place with this bright city, but later on, everything changed for the better. One of the best things about Vanity Fairs in the world was that the people here would always look up to those who stood at the top and worship them, even if they knew that one day in the future, they might personally kill and rob those dazzling treasures that people coveted. However, as long as their strength was not enough, as long as their ambition was not big enough, they would be filled with fanatical worship for power. People take the preferences of those who stand at the top as their preferences. They look up to those in power. People imagine that their lives must be far beyond their imagination. In people's world, power is the only standard. Lu Chen was an outsider. In the beginning, many people did not like him. He seemed to be out of place in this huge city where fame and fortune ran amok. But perfected Lord Tianlan showed him what real power was, and made Lu Chen understand what kind of power he was facing. Unexpectedly, the bald true immortal decided to take Lu Chen as his personal disciple. He was the only one who had ever accepted Lu Chen as his disciple. Then, he solemnly held a grand and unprecedentedly grand apprenticeship ceremony. All the powerful people on Mount Celestial Dragon, who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world in the Immortal City, came to the scene to support this young man who became rich overnight. From a nameless shadow, a down-and-out man that no one cared about, he had become a hot young talent in the true Immortal Alliance in one go. He was a strong contender for the position of power in the true Immortal Alliance in the future. He held great power in his hands, and he could even faintly stand up to that woman from the Floating Clouds Agency. The charm of power could be seen from this. Lu Chen was a smart man, even smarter than many people. After getting this rare opportunity, he immediately grasped it tightly and began to change himself. He adapted to the rules of this huge city and learned all kinds of things in this Vanity Fair. He learned very quickly. Of course, this could be attributed to having a good teacher. Even though his feelings for the damn baldy true monarch Tianlan had always been so complicated, it could never change the fact that true monarch Tianlan was a man of great talent and strategy. Even Lu Chen had never wavered in his respect for true monarch Tianlan's strength after so many years. What had wavered in his heart was actually the matter of trust. No one wanted to be perfected Lord Tianlan's enemy, including Lu Chen himself. After perfected Lord Tianlan took Lu Chen away from that room, the atmosphere on Sky Dragon Mountain seemed to be quiet, which lasted for quite a long time. This was actually quite rare for Xianxia, which had always been surging with undercurrents and fighting for power and profit. So much so that everyone secretly muttered in their hearts, "Could it be that there is a big conspiracy happening in some dark corner that I don't know about?" This was a matter of life and death. Not knowing what was going to happen in this huge Vanity Fair, it was simply a sin deserving of death. It might be the best opportunity to climb up, or it might once again remind those who were at a loss that their level was not high enough. Because he had a good master, Lu Chen's level was forcibly raised by a lot in a short period of time. This was an opportunity that countless people were extremely envious of. Correspondingly, he knew much more than ordinary people. Because there were some things that only perfected lords of Huashan realm knew. And now, perfected lords of Huashan realm were telling him secrets that could make people crazy. I'm going to do something big. Perfected Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen when there were only the two of them in the main hall of Kunlun. His expression was solemn and resolute. At the same time, he was gentle and kind to Lu Chen. It seemed that this time he had really made up his mind to completely trust this disciple and was going to share all his secrets with him. Lu Chen could clearly feel this mood of the damn Baldy, but he was not too surprised. Instead, he felt his heart was heavy and even a suffocating dizziness. What a big thing that a perfected lord of Huashan realm, or even a perfected lord of Huashan realm like the damn Baldy, who was arrogant and looked down on the world, would be talking about something big in such a serious manner. It would probably pierce through the sky. With a polite smile on his face, Lu Chen thought to himself. Then he heard what perfected Lord Tianlan said next. I'm going to set up a trap to kill the other old farts in Zhengxianmeng. The smile on Lu Chen's face suddenly froze, and his mind went blank for a moment. Then, in the shortest time possible, he thought about which people in Zhengxianmeng were qualified to be called old farts by perfected Lord Tianlan, and how many of them were worthy of being carefully plotted against by the damn Baldy instead of directly crushing them with his insufferably arrogant strength. The final answer was surprisingly simple. It was so simple that Lu Chen's mouth became dry. Then, from his heart to his mouth, there was only one word left. Lunatic? Are you crazy? Lu Chen stared at the damn Baldy, took a deep breath, and then said with some difficulty, You want to kill that kind of people and several of them? Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and replied with a Then, he looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, What do you think? Am I very powerful? Lu Chen looked up at the magnificent dome of the palace of Kunlun and let out a long breath. Then, he struggled to persuade and said, How about we take it slow and kill them one by one? Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and waved his hand, saying indifferently, Too troublesome. Chapter 635. There was no way to reason with a lunatic. There was a sense of powerlessness in Lu Chen's heart, and he had a deeper understanding of this truth. But very quickly, he discovered that he actually had a little bit of confidence in this madman's crazy plan, and he was even curious about what this crazy Baldy would do next. One is marked by the company one keeps. Will a person who gets close to a Baldy also go crazy? Lu Chen composed himself and scolded himself in his heart. Sitting next to him, Supreme Tianlan seemed to have thought of something and said to Lu Chen, By the way, when you went to the Heavenly Law Hall to find the old man Tiehu and told him about the leaf, what was his reaction? Lu Chen's originally drifting thoughts were pulled back by these words. He thought for a moment and recalled the situation at that time. He opened his mouth and said, After true Lord Tiehu heard what I said, his expression was obviously shocked at that time. However, he quickly regained his composure and revealed a disdainful expression. He didn't say much to me and finally nodded his head and said that he understood. Supreme Tianlan thought for a while and nodded. That's enough. Lu Chen didn't understand him and couldn't help asking, What do you mean? Supreme Tianlan waved his broad palm in front of him, and several of his fingers seemed to be unconsciously flexing and stretching. He glanced at Lu Chen with some complicated emotions in his eyes. It was neither anger nor joy, but a little perplexity. Yes, emotions such as confusion and hesitation were very rare for a person like perfected Lord Tianlan, but he still revealed them at this moment. Lu Chen also noticed this, and he was a little puzzled for a moment because this didn't seem like the person he knew. Or rather, Lu Chen himself had rarely seen such emotions from this damn Baldy in his past interactions with him. However, Supreme Tianlan didn't hesitate for long. He seemed to have made a decision very quickly. He looked at Lu Chen with a smile and began to explain to him. The moment Supreme Tianlan opened his mouth, Lu Chen suddenly understood something. This person could have ignored everyone in the world, but now he was willing to patiently explain his feelings to him. It seemed that he was really willing to treat himself as one of his own. There was no more estrangement or suspicion between them. To outsiders, they were master and disciple who were as close as father and son, but in fact, they could feel that there was still a distance between them, just like a river or a ditch between them. That ditch and the river were actually not wide and could be easily crossed. However, the two men always stood on his side and did not take the initiative to take the step. It was a very subtle and complicated emotion that involved so many years of ups and downs, and also related to the most basic bit of trust between them. Until this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt that Supreme Tianlan seemed to have suddenly decided not to wait and was willing to take the initiative to accept him. What made him suddenly decide to give up all his worries and really trust him? Lu Chen thought of the blow he struck his head in Su Qingjuan's room. What Taihu said, at least he didn't deny that Yi is now in his hands, Supreme Tianlan said lightly. Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, it's enough to know this. In the future, we'll think of a way to snatch that thing from him. Snatch something from the hands of a divine transformation realm perfected cultivator. Lu Chen smiled bitterly and tried to get used to this way of speaking. Then he frowned and asked, from what you said, it seems that the fragments of the divine tree of the devil cult are very important to you? Supreme Tianlan seemed to have suddenly established a firm trust in Lu Chen. He nodded and said, that's right. Although these items are evil, they are the only treasures in the world that possess the legendary power of the gods. They are of great use to me. Lu Chen looked a little solemn. It seemed that he felt complicated and uneasy about these few devil cult items. He raised his hand as if he wanted to touch something, but he quickly put it down when it was halfway to his chest. He frowned and said to Supreme Tianlan in a low voice, I don't know what you want to do, but these items belong to the devil cult after all. It may be okay to keep them secretly, but if you take them out and use them, I'm afraid there will be a lot of criticism. Supreme Tianlan looked calm and said, it's okay. Seeing his determined expression, Lu Chen didn't try to persuade him anymore. However, his expression was still solemn as if he was under a lot of pressure. After a while, he asked Perfected Lord Tianlan, 1 branch, 2 leaves, and 1 seed. Do you need to get all 4 pieces of the divine tree? Supreme Tianlan hesitated for a moment before saying, that's not it. Of course, it's best to have all 4 for the greatest effect. However, if you have at least 2 leaves, it should be barely enough. He paused for a moment before adding, out of these 4 fragments, the seed has the strongest spiritual energy and is much stronger than the other 3, so if I only have 1 seed, I will be able to use it. Otherwise, I will need at least 2 leaves. Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he let out a breath of turbid air and said softly, but you only know that there's a leaf in the iron kettle now, right? Supreme Tianlan suddenly sneered and said with a solemn expression, I have a second one. Lu Chen's body shuddered and his expression changed starkly as he raised his head and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Atsu, who was in the courtyard, suddenly raised its head and looked in the direction of the top of Sky Dragon Mountain. It seemed to have sensed something at that moment and looked over with a hint of worry. But perhaps it was because the feeling was still fleeting, or perhaps it was because the distance was too far that even Atu wasn't too sure. So after a while, Atu quietly laid back on the ground again. This was the old house at the horse washing bridge in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City. The house on the mountain collapsed and Old Ma was entrusted by Lu Chen to look for White Lotus. He found the girl in the rubble and realized that she was still alive. The atmosphere on the mountain was a bit weird, and the identity of White Lotus became more and more awkward. It was obvious that Supreme Tianlan carried Lu Chen out of that house and then the house collapsed, but he did not care about White Lotus at all. This bald Supreme's attitude was very clear. If Lu Chen, who was on the back of Supreme Tianlan, had not told Old Ma in public, Old Ma suspected that he might not have been able to carry White Lotus down the mountain safely. But even so, Old Ma felt that there might be many eyes staring at them outside the house at this moment. Women are really troublesome. Old Ma looked at the beautiful girl lying on the bed in the house and sighed with emotion. Although he did not know whether this White Lotus had made a mistake or touched the bottom line of Supreme Tianlan, It should not be a secret that Supreme Tianlan did not like this person, or perhaps he would prefer her to be dead. Why couldn't Lu Chen understand this? Old Ma shook his head and was ready to leave. But just as he was about to leave, he suddenly glanced at White Lotus out of the corner of his eye and saw a faint green light suddenly flashing. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. He took a step forward and found a strange green twig-shaped chain around White Lotus' neck. He did not know when it had slipped out, but it seemed to be stimulated by something. The small twig was shining brightly, as if something was coming back to life. Chapter 636. Old Ma suspiciously stared at the strange necklace exposed on White Lotus's fair skin. The faint green light flickered silently. The light was very gentle, not dazzling, and did not seem to have any dangerous aura. Instead, it carried a faint vitality of life. But Old Ma could still vaguely feel, in this branch-shaped thing, there seemed to be some fragility, or it should be said, a little like a person who was out of breath. Of course, exactly what was the specific situation, Old Ma also did not dare to easily make a conclusion. After all, he had never seen this thing before, just that right now his expression seemed to have turned solemn after the initial shock. All these years, although Old Ma's reputation was not prominent and he did not make any world-famous achievements, but in fact in these 10 or 20 long years, he had always stood together with Lu Chen at the forefront of the battle against the evil sect. Although what he did was the most inconspicuous and most secretive kind of work, but in fact his position was exceptionally important. If Lu Chen in that period of time was said to be the shadow who dived into the deep waters, fighting with the bloody shoals of fish in the dark shadows, then Old Ma was the only tube that Lu Chen could breathe through from the suffocating water surface. And it was precisely because of this, with Lu Chen's unyielding and suspicious mind, despite the ups and downs over the years, Old Ma to him was still the most trustworthy and most willing to get close to person. This was a friendship that had been honed in those despairing and painful years, experienced the test of life and death and blood. For shadows like them, trust was the most extravagant emotion. One must know, Lu Chen even once suspected that tallest figure. To be able to gain Lu Chen's trust and survive for so many years in the underground dark world fighting against the evil sect, Old Ma of course could not be a useless person, and even more could not be a person who knew nothing about the evil sect. On the contrary, his understanding of the evil faction was definitely one of the top few in the world. There was an old saying, the person who wanted to understand you the most must be your enemy. Based on Old Ma's knowledge of the evil sect, when he saw the branch-shaped chain, a word suddenly flashed across his mind: divine tree. Yes, although the 4 divine weapons of the devil cult were secretive, people like them definitely knew about them. However, because of his different identity from Lu Chen, Old Ma had actually never seen the 4 pieces of the so-called 1 branch, 2 leaves and 1 seed of the divine tree. Whether it was the legendary treasure or not, Old Ma really did not dare to draw a conclusion. Furthermore, no matter what, White Lotus was the last disciple of a deity-stage true monarch of the Kunlun party. How could the devil cult's divine weapon be with her? This possibility was a little unimaginable, but Old Ma still stared at the chain. After a moment, he slowly took a step forward and stood in front of the seemingly unconscious White Lotus. He seemed to be hesitant, but in the end he still stretched out his hand and gently touched the chain. There were too many things in this world that seemed impossible. Some were like the collapse of heaven and earth, some were like the vicissitudes of the world, and some were things that people firmly believed would not happen. For example, parents were always loving, even a vicious tiger would not eat its cubs, or lovers were always faithful, would not separate and would not betray, and there were also people who firmly believed that the person they trusted would not stab them in the back. Old Ma had lived for so many years and watched the dark world behind the light. Other than the collapse of heaven and earth and vicissitudes of the world, he had seen everything else. He knew that in this world there was nothing that was eternal and unchanging. Many times it was just a kind of fantasy and illusion that people were willing to believe in. At that moment, when his fingers were about to touch White Lotus's fair neck, his heart suddenly tightened, as if he had sensed some kind of danger. But at the same time in his heart, a thought that he had thought of a long time ago flashed past. That year in that desolate valley, when Lu Chen betrayed those evil cult teachers and stabbed the black blade into their backs, those evil people probably also had this kind of absurd thought? Perhaps it was because these few years he had finally left the front line of the battle with the evil cult. This fatty who was once vigilant still had some slack. So much so that his state of mind at this moment suddenly became careless. He did not notice that in this close proximity, White Lotus, who was lying on the bed, suddenly clenched her fists. In his eyes, there was only that faint green light. In his mind, there was only the voice of the evil cult treasure echoing in amazement. Lu Chen was once a shadow. He had stayed in the world's most dangerous and treacherous evil cult for 10 years. He had seen many things, encountered countless dangers and unimaginable accidents, but in the end he had survived them all, until today. Therefore, right now he actually rarely had that kind of huge emotional fluctuation, because when he encountered an unexpected accident, he would often instinctively suppress his shock and quickly calm down, start to judge the direction of the situation and then decide what he should do next. This was a very important reason why he was able to live till today, because this kind of invisible ability was too hidden, so sometimes he even needed to show panic when he was not panicking, in a calm situation, make himself look very anxious, as if he was about to lose control. Of course, he was also human. He also had weaknesses. Even someone as calm and cold as him, these few years there were also times when he lost control of his emotions. And every time he lost control of himself, someone would die in his hands. On this day, in this Kunlun palace, Lu Chen revealed a shocked expression, but this time it was not an act. He was really shocked. He was so surprised that he even stood up and stared at Supreme Lord Tianlan. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed not to care about Lu Chen's loss of composure, or perhaps he had already expected it. He did not say a word, only smiled, and gently rotated his fingers. Both of their gazes landed on perfected Lord Tianlan's hand. His finger, which had been empty previously, now had a small object. It was a piece of green, full of life. This was a leaf without branches to rely on. This was a leaf without a foundation. However, it was different from the leaves in the world that quickly withered after leaving the trunk and branches. This leaf was filled with the aura of life and spiritual power. The power was so abundant that it even gave people the feeling that this leaf was directly absorbing energy and spiritual power from the space around it. The emerald green light encircled the leaf, as if announcing its identity. Lu Chen did not need to think carefully to know the origin of this thing. There were only 2 such leaves in the world. They were both evil, legendary treasures of the evil devil cult, and this was one of the only 2 leaves left in this world by the Tree of God. Where did this come from? Lu Chen raised his head, looked at Supreme Lord Tianlan, and asked word by word. Chapter 637. Lu Chen could be said to be one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about the 4 mysterious fragments of the Tree of God that had been passed down in the devil cult since ancient times. Among the 4 fragments, the seed was undoubtedly the most powerful and the most important one. In the Battle of the Desolate Valley, the 3 elders of the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe directly activated the spiritual power of the seed and activated the most powerful god-subduing spell formation of the devil cult since ancient times. It was almost a heaven-defying thing. Of course, in the end, they failed at the last step. This was also the reason why the devil cult hated the shadow called Black Wolf and the initiator Fuyunji to the bone. They hunted them down and took revenge for many years. Although there were countless bloody stories in the process, it was undeniable that the Battle of the Desolate Valley had really hurt the foundation and vitality of the devil cult. In addition, there was a gathering of the righteous here. Xianxia had many outstanding talents, and there was even Supreme Tianlan, a peerless figure with great talent and bold vision. In the end, the devil cult, a sect with a long history, was finally completely destroyed. In addition, Lu Chen actually knew the whereabouts of the 4 treasures that many people could not figure out. The most important seed of the 4 fragments of the Tree of God was hidden in his body. It merged with his body and became that strange and mysterious ancient tree whole space. He had seen the branch of the Tree of God before. Strangely, it was on White Lotus. But when he entered the tree hole of the Tree of God, Lu Chen clearly felt that the tree hole formed by the seed seemed to have absorbed a large part of the spiritual power essence from the branch and changed the shape of the tree hole. Because of this, he did not try to snatch the branch from White Lotus. Part of the reason was that the situation was very delicate at that time, but the main reason was that he felt that he did not need the branch. The last 2 leaves were unknown to him. Although he occasionally encountered some clues over the years, it was not until recently that he was sure that one of the leaves was actually in the hands of Supreme Tiehu of Zhangxianmeng. As for the last leaf, he really did not know the whereabouts of it. He knew 3 of the 4 treasures and had the most important one or even 2. No one in the world knew this secret except for himself. He thought he had basically mastered this secret until he suddenly saw the leaf in Supreme Tianlan's hand. Sure enough, there were always unexpected things in this world, and this perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to always be able to do things that others couldn't. He was always giving people a shock or a surprise. Where did this come from? The first thought that popped into Lu Chen's mind was that this crazy baldy couldn't have suddenly run over to the Heavenly Law Hall last night, killed Tai Hu, and then snatched his leaf, right? Without a doubt, this idea was completely unreasonable and filled with madness. It was a ridiculous fantasy, but Lu Chen soon discovered that he actually didn't dare to completely rule out this possibility. However, Lu Chen soon found that he did not dare to completely rule out this possibility. This kind of scalp-numbing thing happened to this damn baldy. He stared at Supreme Tianlan and clenched his teeth hard. Supreme Tianlan's expression looked much calmer and gentler. He even looked a little happy, as if he was very gratified by Lu Chen's shocked expression. He smiled and said to him, "How is it? You didn't expect me to have this treasure, did you? Did you get a shock?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and nodded heavily. "Yes, I was almost scared to death." Supreme Tianlan laughed and suddenly flicked his finger. The leaf flew into the air and then floated lightly toward Lu Chen. Lu Chen's heart suddenly jumped and his body tensed up almost subconsciously. His eyes were fixed on the leaf. He could even feel a sudden violent vibration in a certain part of his body. To be honest, at this moment, Lu Chen was really afraid. He was afraid that the seed hidden in his heart would sense this leaf and then do something that he could not control. After all, for so many years, Lu Chen had almost no control over the tree hole formed by the seed other than himself, who could enter and exit the mysterious tree hole, even if he had used up all the immortal water that was once filled with life's spiritual energy. Fortunately, it was unknown whether the seed had a mind of its own, or it did not have a particularly big reaction. After the initial commotion, it quickly quieted down. Even when Lu Chen reached out to take the leaf, the seed did not move at all. Lu Chen heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. He felt that even if he had a tough heart, this kind of repeated torture and fright was a little too much for him to bear. It was probably going to shorten his life. When he held the leaf in his palm, he felt a vaguely familiar feeling. It was the unique aura of abundant life spiritual energy, which he felt when he immersed himself in the immortal water in the tree hole. Based on this feeling alone, Lu Chen could determine that this leaf was real. The damn baldy had actually gotten his hands on a leaf of the Tree of God. He raised his head and looked at the damn baldy. Although he did not speak this time, the puzzled look in his eyes had already revealed his meaning. At the same time, there was a more complicated meaning. He did not speak, but perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be able to read his mind. He chuckled and folded his arms in front of his abdomen, saying, "Don't guess blindly." Although the old man Tai Hu is unbearable, he is after all a perfected lord of the divine transformation realm for many years. How can he be so easy to kill? This leaf is not the one in his hand. Lu Chen nodded silently. In his heart he thought, as expected, this world is still considered normal, although it seems to be almost full of lunatics. He calculated in his heart, and his eyes fell on the leaf again. He thought, is this the 4th and last fragment of the Tree of God that has been missing for a long time? He held the leaf lightly, then returned it to perfected Lord Tianlan without changing his expression. He said, "If it is not perfected Lord Tai Hu's, then this is." His voice suddenly paused as if he suddenly thought of something. In his memory, the damn Baldy did not have any fragments of the Tree of God. Moreover, he knew the whereabouts of the other 3 fragments and could not have been taken away by him. In other words, the damn Baldy most likely obtained this leaf recently. What happened recently? What could possibly be related to this divine weapon fragment? The answer was almost obvious. Lu Chen closed his eyes slightly. He felt that his throat was a little dry, and a strange and complicated expression appeared on his face. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a smile and a deep gaze. He said, "Have you figured it out?" Lu Chen sighed and said, "I didn't expect it to be with him. Actually, I should have thought of it long ago. Apart from him, there is no one else." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. He walked over and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. He said with a smile, "This is all thanks to you. It can be said that it did not take me any effort to get it. With this, as long as I find the other fragment, there is no need to worry about failure. Heaven is helping me." Chapter 638. It was the leaf carried by Elder Ghost. To be honest, although this answer was a little abrupt, it was not too surprising after thinking about it carefully. As the last leader of the devil cult who had the power to rally people, Elder Ghost undoubtedly controlled the last resources of the devil cult, including those unspeakable secrets. The shards of the Tree of God to the evil sect was the most sacred holy object, just that after thousands of years of changes in the world, the 4 shards had also scattered. Lu Chen knew that 3 of the shards' exact whereabouts were no longer in the hands of the evil sect people, then the last leaf was still in the evil sect, still hidden in Elder Ghost's hands. It was actually a very logical thing. However, it seemed to have benefited Perfected Lord Tianlan. He followed Lu Chen to the underground city and met Elder Ghost. He killed this old rival who had been fighting with him for decades and took a piece of leaf. Even Lu Chen could not help but marvel at the luck of this damn Baldy. He muttered in his heart, "Is this the luck of the current number 1? It was originally extremely difficult to kill Elder Ghost and find that piece of leaf. In the end, Perfected Lord Tianlan only followed him to the underground city and settled everything in one go. If it was not for the fact that Lu Chen knew that he was the one who first encountered those strange things in the underground city and that he was the one who brought Perfected Lord Tianlan down, he would really suspect whether all of this was a conspiracy planned by Perfected Lord Tianlan himself. Even when Perfected Lord Tianlan sent him back to the surface, it was also his intention to kill and rob. In any case, everything was in the past now, and it was a foregone conclusion. Lu Chen had nothing more to say. In any case, at least for now, this person before him was truly unparalleled in the world, unstoppable, and even the heavens were on his side. Although this guy was a lunatic, but a lunatic who was lucky and capable, Lu Chen felt a little pain in his teeth again. Now we just have to wait for the last Blood Sea anomaly to appear in the sky. When that time comes, it will be the moment when the Blood Moon's aura reaches its peak and also the time when our plan starts to be implemented. It seemed that Perfected Lord Tianlan had complete trust in Lu Chen, even though Lu Chen himself was surprised by this kind of treatment. However, he had never been able to figure out what Perfected Lord Tianlan was thinking, so he could only let nature take its course. But to be honest, who in the world could really see through Perfected Lord Tianlan? Blood Moon? The last time the Blood Sea phenomenon will appear? Although Lu Chen had not heard the complete so-called plan from Perfected Lord Tianlan, he still quickly and keenly grasped a few key points in the damn Baldy's words. Just as he was about to ask in detail, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly frowned as if he had thought of something. He muttered to himself, that's not right." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. He saw Perfected Lord Tianlan's hesitation and vigilance at this moment, which was rare for him. He would not act like this unless there was a major event. Lu Chen could not help but ask, "What's wrong?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. His gaze was deep as he said slowly, "I thought of something. Some time ago, I once asked Perfected Lord Guyu of Starry Hall to divine the whereabouts of the 4 pieces of the divine tree of the devil cult. He also performed his divination very carefully and finally told me that there is only one piece in this immortal city. The whereabouts of the other 3 pieces are unknown. Lu Chen's heart shook, but he still maintained his composure on the surface. After a moment he asked softly, when exactly did he do the divination? Could it be that someone else brought the fragment to the immortal city after he did the divination? Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head slowly. The glimmer in the depths of his eyes was dim and difficult to understand. He said, now it seems that from the beginning there were at least 2 of the 4 pieces of leaves in this immortal city. Elder Tai who has one, Elder Gui has another. There are also branches and seeds. It's hard to say if we don't know about it now, but he should have lied to me. Did Perfected Lord Guyu lie to Perfected Lord Tianlan? Why did he lie? This was a simple question, but the hidden matter was very big. The impact might be even bigger. Lu Chen didn't dare to say more. But now, he actually didn't care about Perfected Lord Guyu's intentions. Because he suddenly thought of another thing. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be determined to get these pieces of the devil cult's divine weapon. But other than the 2 pieces of leaves, the remaining 2 pieces, namely the branches and seeds, were also in this immortal city. The seeds were right in front of him, on Lu Chen's body. The branches were at White Lotus's side. Everything was actually under his nose. If this secret was discovered by Perfected Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen suddenly felt that not only did he have a toothache, but even his breathing started to become a little difficult. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression looked a little solemn. He walked back and forth in the hall with his hands behind his back. After a while, he turned his head and said to Lu Chen, this matter has a great impact. We can't treat it lightly. I still have to go and deal with it. With that, he turned and walked out of the hall. Lu Chen subconsciously wanted to say something to him, but he quickly held back. There were some things that couldn't be explained. Even if it was the truth, if others didn't believe it, everything would be as good as nothing and the truth would become false. Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure quickly disappeared outside the hall. Lu Chen slowly walked out. When the sunlight shone on him, he slightly narrowed his eyes and looked up at the sky. The world was bright and the sky was high and wide. There was not a bit of hostility or any trace of the blood sea. Looking at the sky in front of him, it was simply impossible to imagine that it would be covered by the strange blood sea phenomenon. When the blood sea phenomenon appeared again, something would definitely happen, right? Lu Chen didn't have the intention to ask Perfected Lord Tianlan immediately. At least from the looks of it, Perfected Lord Tianlan would tell him sooner or later. But now, he had a more important and urgent matter in front of him. Lu Chen calmed his mind and then strode in the direction of the mountain. Earlier, Old Ma had sent someone to tell him that White Lotus was indeed still alive and that he had dug her out from the ruins of that house. Because of the subtle atmosphere on Sky Dragon Mountain, it was indeed not suitable for White Lotus to continue staying on the mountain. Otherwise, who knew whether some greedy guy would run out and kill this girl and then ask for credit from Perfected Lord Tianlan. Old Ma brought White Lotus to the house next to the horse washing bridge at the foot of the mountain. Lu Chen decided to go and see her as soon as possible. Of course, this was just an excuse. In his heart, an originally unimportant matter had now become an urgent matter. The branch necklace still hanging on White Lotus's neck suddenly became a very troublesome thing. If the damn Baldy found this thing and came back to ask Lu Chen why he didn't tell him, it would be hard for Lu Chen to explain. Even if he didn't admit that he had seen it, would White Lotus stab him in the back and tell the damn Baldy that she had seen this branch before? Lu Chen felt that it was hard for the damn Baldy not to be suspicious given how much importance he attached to the fragment of the devil cult's sacred tree. What he didn't want to lose now was the damn Baldy's trust in him. He had a vague feeling that in the upcoming upheaval, perhaps the damn Baldy's trust was his biggest reliance. But when he walked quickly down the mountain, he was still a little upset. It was really not easy to deal with White Lotus. That girl seemed to never be really controlled by anyone. How could he make her completely, reliably, and truly shut up? Dead people? As Lu Chen walked in silence, this thought flashed through his mind. Then he was shocked, but then he found that his heart was actually calm. For him, perhaps life and death had long been a numb, cold, and hard thing. He seemed to have really lost the feelings that should have been warm. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.